Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Okay, we're going to begin on this lecture within the program of the Master of Science in Bioethics and the course on the beginning of human life. And we're going to be looking at two other controversial issues at the beginning of human life: the issue of contraception and the issue of in vitro fertilization. So beginning as always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in us the fire of your divine love. In the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. All right. So as always, if there are any questions or comments from the previous lectures, anything at all, the course, the program? All right. So we're looking at the beginning, the bioethical issues at the beginning of human life. And we had spent some time establishing that human life, just like any organic life here on Earth, begins at the moment of fertilization. And from then forward, we have a new individual with its own genetic identity and so forth. And it's logical to assume that God then grants us all at that point, so that we have that substantial union or unity between body and soul. And moving forward from there, then we're always in some stage of development, drastic as it may be during the embryonic stage, and then a little more toned down, if you will, from birth until we die, but continuous development. In other words, there is no stage of development from fertilization to death that is substantially different, substantially meaning that there's a change in the being of that person, so that hypothetically before that stage, that being is not human, and then all of a sudden after this stage, that being becomes human. There is no such thing when we look at the development of the human from fertilization forward, and for any other, we see that same consistent development in any other species that reproduces sexually also, right? Then based on that statement that human life begins at fertilization or conception, that has drastic consequences in today's society with regards to, for example, legalized abortion, which truly then is the killing of an innocent human being when it is intentional. Not talking about a spontaneous abortion or spontaneous miscarriage, which is an act of nature, but rather when it is procured, when the will is engaged, then that is objectively killing an innocent human being, which should not be done, all right? I'm also going to make a distinction here, which is valid along the whole course of the program, which is, whereas we can judge objective reality, in other words, human behavior, to be objectively right or wrong, we never pass judgment on the conscience of the person. The person may or may not be guilty, and the degree of guilt may be attenuated depending on a number of circumstances, one of which is ignorance, all right? Considering that it is so prevalent in society for so many decades now, excuse me, many people have come to believe that the human embryo is not human or not fully human. Sadly, it is very, very sad to see that we're in such a precarious state of reasoning that we actually can accept in our minds, whether consciously or not, there are degrees of humanity, whereby some humans are less human or not fully human, all right? That makes them literally subhuman or lesser human category, which is, again, an injustice and should be illegal to think that way, because then if we do that for the unborn, then we can go from the born forward. How about the handicap? How on the ones that we don't like or look different from us or missing limbs? You know, we can say, well, they're less human too because they don't fit our model of this external perfection. Yeah? And so there are inconsistencies, there are logical inconsistencies in our society which have been legalized, have been set into law for the whole, at the federal level, for the whole land. And in my opinion, that has, the end result of that over the years is that it has produced a schizophrenic society where we can hold contradictions which are opposite. As soon as that baby is born, imagine the amount of laws that protect that baby. Not only from things that are obviously illegal, like or immoral, like attacking the baby, violating the baby, and so forth, all right? And then the children, and so on and so forth. But even to the point of the security systems that we have, the protection systems that we have for children, toning down the speed of cars to 15 miles an hour so that one can stop at a moment's notice if a child jumps in front of us, and so forth, all right? So we've taken extreme care to protect society, to protect children as soon as they're born.
You can't even leave the hospital without a car seat, and they have to come down and inspect.
And actually, the car seat, all right, for the child, up to, I think it's 4 years old, right? Because I'm helping a lady now who has a 4-year-old, and she has 3 babies, and she needs a car that can fit 3 car seats in the back, so she needs a large car.
I think it actually depends on the weight.
Oh, the weight, the actual weight.
Yeah,
all right.
I know.
Okay.
Well, car seat and
yes,
booster seat.
Yeah. Right.
In some sort of seat up to
a certain age or weight, right? Yes, and this is all good. Absolutely, we support that. But how can we not support the life of the unborn a minute before birth, like with partial birth abortion, or an hour before, or a week before, or a month before? You know, that's the whole argument of this gradualism. If we take it further back and back, there is no time, there is no stage of development, even the embryonic stage, as drastic it is, from one cell to trillions of cells, that makes that being, whatever that being is, substantially different from the previous stage, as if it were to change species or something like that, or even degrees of humanity, right? And we seem to live with these contradictions because we put them aside. They're uncomfortable. So we put them aside. And yet, I am extremely happy to see that the abortion debate continues in this land after 46 years, all right? And after the conversion of who was Roe, in other words, Norman McCorvey, and so many others. So I'm hopeful that at some point we will wake up to the reality, just like about 150 years ago, more or less, we woke up to the reality that blacks were also humans and they deserve the full protection of the law and integration into society, right? And to be able to be abhorrent to think of a black person to buy or sell a black person for slavery or something like that. Yet it's happening. The black market is happening for, not for blacks necessarily, but for women and children in the human traffic. But that is extremely illegal, right? So these are the inconsistencies in society. Hopefully, almost hopeful that we have to keep the issue on the front burner and keep it simmering and keep out there speaking respectfully but forcefully about the humanity of the humanity. All right. Moving forward now, we're just going to go from one controversial topic to another throughout the whole course. And then when we're done with these, we'll jump into the end of life and continue with controversial topics at the end of human life. So the next one on the list is going to be contraception and non-therapeutic sterilization, which is also intentionally a type of contraception, right? In other words, it's done for contraceptive purposes, non-therapeutic sterilization. Before getting into this, we have to establish a little bit also the anthropology of sexual intimacy, just like we did the anthropology of the human individual. In other words, the ontology, our human origin, right, at the individual level. And just like we did at last course, the phylogeny, the beginning of the human species, then within the past 3 weeks or so, I've been doing the origin of the human individual, each one of us, the ontology. Now we need to take it a step further, if you will, for Excuse me, let me stop for a moment. I'm sorry, pause for a moment. Okay, sorry for that. So you see, now we established the human individual, and we went through all the challenges of ensoulment in special cases like monozygotic twins and the twin reabsorption. But at the end of the day, we can give a logical, rational explanation for the scenarios there. And if you follow the logic, I think it's consistent with the biology, the embryology that is happening. The beginning of your individual, and then further down, if that individual dies, then that soul goes to God, and we're back to the one soul of the other individual who survives. Okay. All right. Now we have to take it further because with regards to contraception, we need to look at the intention. The intention is to avoid children by using artificial means. Right? So, to avoid children by using artificial means, and kind of jumping forward a little bit here, but it's at the level of intention. So again, we see the will engaged, just like we saw the will engaged in procured abortion, right? The will is also engaged in contraception. So it's at the level of intentionality. Even before the actual act takes place, there is an internal act, if you will, of seeking to avoid children by some artificial means. I make emphasis on artificial means because at some point we're going to talk about natural family planning, which is a natural means. And the reason why I mentioned seeking to avoid children is because even NFP could be used with a contraceptive mentality when there is no grave justification for not having children. Okay, but let's bracket that for a moment and just come back to contraception, which has to do with the intimacy of the couple, with the sexual intimacy of the couple and their intentions with regards to that intimacy. So we have to do a little anthropology, if you will, of the human relations, the human intimacy. And that will lead us to recognize these two dimensions, the unitive and the procreative dimensions of human sexual intimacy. And then finally get into the bioethical analysis of contraception. So let's move forward with regards to human sexual intercourse. I propose that it is unique at three levels. At the physical level, at the psychological level, and even at the spiritual level, okay? Again, considering that we don't hold a dualistic view of the human person, but rather a Unitarian view, integrated, we are body and soul one, as St. John Paul II said many times. Accepting that, then when there is, for human intercourse to be truly human, these three dimensions should be engaged. Otherwise, it's just an instinctive behavior and it will stay merely at the physical level or even at the psychological level, but in a selfish way, right? So let's deal a little bit more as mature adults, what is involved in this human sexual intercourse. First, from the physical, I need to go back and forth here for a moment. Yeah. So let's start here at the physical or physiological level. We humans as part of the mammals, all right? We notice that there are three levels also, or three aspects of sexual reproduction. So the first aspect of sexual reproduction is precisely the union of gametes. That union of gametes doesn't have to involve mating necessarily or intercourse. There are a number of species that reproduce sexually, but they don't have intercourse as such. For example, fish, all right? To stay with the vertebrates, the fish, the female lays the eggs on the bottom of the pond, the lake, or the river, or the ocean, and then the male secretes the smelt, which is the fish equivalent of sperm or semen, and then in that smelt will the millions of sperm, which will then swim through the liquid and fertilize whatever eggs they can. So you see there's a lot of chance there and hit and miss, And then, again, natural selection kicks in because on average, it will be the strongest sperm that will fertilize whatever egg it finds. But there's no copulation as such with the fish, all right? So it's external fertilization, but it is sexual reproduction. So that's one level. When we go a little higher or more complex on the vertebrates, we start encountering also intercourse, all right, which will be for reptiles and birds and mammals. In other words, in addition, or the sexual reproduction itself also involves intercourse, involves the mating of the male and female. But then we notice that of those other four classes of vertebrates, right, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, sorry, three, then not all of them have gestation as such, have a pregnancy. In fact, most of them don't have pregnancy. The embryo develops within an egg, a shelled egg that is a hard or semi-hard egg. In the case of reptiles, the embryo is encased in an egg with a yolk sac, and once that yolk sac is consumed, that little newborn has to fend for itself typically. Snakes, lizards, turtles, and so forth, all the reptiles, okay, they will have, typically it's a soft egg, but semi-soft. There is calcium, but it's more leathery-like. The point is that there is no pregnancy as such for the mother, there is no placenta, there's a yolk sac. So once we get to, and the birds the same, once we get to the mammals, then we see that there is sexual reproduction that involves copulation, intercourse, and also gestation. Gestation meaning there will be the development of placenta, and the embryo has to spend X amount of time within the mother's body to develop, to finish the development enough to be born and to be out into the world, all right? And that could be as short as, I think, about 3 weeks in rats and mice. They have a litter every 3 weeks, more or less, and they will have a litter of 6, 8, you know, fairly large. So that's a pretty fast reproductive turnover for the rodents. The other extreme could be, I think, the whales or some relatively large mammals may have a gestation of over a year. I mean, 12, 13, 14 months. But we're somewhere in the middle, a little bit on the long side, 9 months. And you also notice that in general, the animals that have gestation, that have a pregnancy stage, also tend to have fewer progeny. Fewer progeny, they're more protected, right? To the point that we, on average, the standard for humans is 1 progeny at a time. Every now and then they're twins and so forth, but the standard is 1. So there's more protection to the embryo or the fetus in that crucial developmental stage by being literally inside the body of someone else, of the mother. There's all the feeding that occurs, and nutrition and so forth. Fewer in progeny, fewer number. Longer period is mostly to develop what do you think is the most sensitive organ system of the body, the most delicate and the most complex system of the body, the nervous system, right? All the way from cephalization, the formation of the brain, the spinal cord, and then all the nervature that has to reticulate and nerve all the organ systems, all the other organs and tissues for the thing to function. So that takes the longest. And even when the baby is born, the baby certainly doesn't have a mature nervous system, especially the brain. It will take another 20 to 25 years on average to get to the final networking of the synapses at the cerebral cortex to have what we would consider a neurologically mature brain, therefore an adult in legal terms. And I think I talked about the car insurance issue, that the rate, the insurance rate changes at 25, it drops at 25, which is estimated that the human brain ends its cephalization, or the actual Well, it grows. For example, you compare the size of the head of a baby to the size of the head of an adult, and the baby is much smaller, right? Because the brain continues to grow physically, physiologically. But then by the time we're around the teen years, I would say we pretty much have the full size of the brain, of the cranium. But then the synapses need to finish connecting, right? The billions and billions of synapses that we have on the cortex particularly, which is where higher thought occurs, reasoning and so forth, abstract thought. And that takes another 10 years more or less from teenage to between 20 to 25 years of age in the human. So the car insurance industry uses the upper limit of that average, it's 25, to lower the rate of insurance because they're based on statistics. So on average, supposed to be that a 26-year-old human is more mature than a 24-year-old human. And that's where they change the rate. And I guess they also must be evidence-based, so they probably do the stats on the accidents and so forth and correlate the age to the accident, and it reinforces that upper limit. All right, so back to the fact that as mammals, we are the only group of animals that reproduces sexually, but also involves intercourse and gestation. But so in that aspect, we're not unique to the other mammals, right? But we are unique in a number of other things, a couple of things specifically. Number one, it is so obvious that people forget. No other mammal, I'm going to look at mammals now, no other mammal has intercourse face-to-face. Interesting. All the other mammals is what we call the mounting from behind. It's not anal sex, be very clear, it's the female reproductive organ, but is set in a way that is approached from behind and not in front. And so we humans have that unique characteristic, and if you think about the anatomy, it developed that characteristic was kind of a secondary, probably a side effect from becoming upright, from becoming bipedal, because all the other mammals technically are quadrupeds. They normally walk on four. Even the primates who get up periodically, but remember the knock of walking. Eventually they have to go down on four because they don't have the S curvature on the spine, right? And so it's probably originally just anatomically thinking a byproduct of becoming bipedal. Mm-hmm. But anyway, what we are today, all right, the natural human intercourse is face-to-face, which already then engages the faces, whether they look at each other or not, all right? But remember, the face is the prosopon. It is like the summary of the person and expresses sentiments, feelings, and emotions, and so forth. So there is also a sharing, or the potential for a sharing at the psychological level. That's the intimacy. So the intimacy is not just physiologically, it naturally flows into a psychological intimacy also in sharing those emotions, which is a very intimate moment, right? Okay. So you see there is a consistency here, at least between the physical and the psychological, just in the unique human anatomy, right? In the unique anatomy of the human and the human couple, in the natural complementarity of those two bodies. Right. Now, another aspect, which is the whole issue of reproduction and reproducing or procreating. In the other mammals, the female will only accept the male when she's ovulating. It's called estrus, all right, when she's estrus. Just this morning, I mean, not a week goes by, this morning I was reading in the BBC an article of this Malayan tigers, which are smaller than the Bengal tiger, than the normal tiger from India that we're used to, which is a huge cat. The Malayan tigers are pretty much the same pattern and shape and so forth, but they're smaller. They're like midgets. And they're endangered species, and there are a number of zoos in the world that are now specializing in breeding endangered species particularly, and then they sell them or they trade them and whatever. Some are released back into the wild to repopulate. But anyway, there was this, it was in London, that they had this Malayan female tiger, and her mate had been sent to another zoo, I think in France, all right? So she was without a mate. She had had several cubs already from that other mate, that other male that was sent to France. And so I guess they were doing some experiments, and the article didn't say exactly why, but I am guessing that it is to maintain heterozygosity, to maintain the variation as much as possible. Because if an endangered group becomes so small that they're only breeding among themselves because that's the only species, or the only individuals left in the species, then that population can start getting, lose heterozygosity, lose the variation in them, in the different genes, okay? And so at some point it would be, I've heard this of the cheetah in the wild. The cheetah, I think there's only about maybe 100 left or so in the wild and in Africa. And what happens is that clan is so small, they're all related. They're all relatives of each other. And so there is a loss of variation. And you know, if the climate changes somewhat, when there is less variation, those individuals are less likely to survive also. All right, and they may look fine to us, just to the eye, but it could be at the level of behavior, level of performance. Maybe they're losing speed or something like that, which will be an advantage or a disadvantage at the moment of survival. Mm-hmm. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that they brought this other male from Scandinavia somewhere, I think it was Sweden or something like that, to mate with this female tiger in London. And of course, it's a gradual process. You cannot just release the new male in there, all right, even if it's a large territory and so forth. It was gradual. First, they introduced him to the environment without contact with the female so that he would become accustomed to the new environment, and that went fine and so forth. And then at some point, over some time, I don't know if it was weeks or so, the moment came for letting the male meet with the female and see what happens, all right? Well, so the encounter happened, the introduction and whatnot, and this male had a reputation for being very gentle with his, he says, with his ladies, okay, with the females that he has mated before. So he had that reputation of being a gentle male. Well, lo and behold, they start interacting in their instinctive way, and the interaction starts getting a little aggressive and more aggressive, more aggressive, and the male ends up killing the female. All right, well, they were separated finally before she was actually dead, but she was so maimed and mauled that she couldn't be saved by the vets. And so they lost the female, which is precious because she's the one that has the potential for raising the children, you know, raising the cubs and all that. So there you have it. And my intuition, again, the article did not go into the biological details of all this, but I bet you had to do something with the hormonal balance, that she was not quite ready. But because being a male, a mature male, he's always ready, and he became too aggressive. There's an element of violence also in sexual intercourse, okay? There's an element of violence there that in the human, again, we override that. And in nature, it's only overridden when the female is ovulating, okay? Normally, it's the other way around. In other words, in the wild, when a male, again, we're talking about mature adults, right? Reproductive maturity. When a male tries to mount a female outside of her ovulation, all right, she will turn around and just kill him. She will not allow herself to be mated. And so typically the scenario for mammals is that the males are constantly trailing. They trail the female at a certain distance, at a prudent distance, all right? And the female is going around tagging her territory. She's spraying as she urinates in her territory, and she is establishing her boundaries. That urine will also have a percentage of estrogen, and the male is just smelling those spots to see when that estrogen starts to peak, right? And that is the biochemical signal that the female is going to be docile enough to allow herself to be mounted. And sure enough, you see these films and everything else, and the female will be walking along, tagging the places, and the male will be around smelling and smelling until at some point she becomes estrus and she's ovulated, so she'll lie down very nicely and just assume the position, and the male will mount her. And that will take maybe a minute or less, and then he's out of there, okay? Because then once that happens and she is beyond the ovulation, she will become aggressive to him again. And typically the female is, in that sense, is stronger than the male and can really kill the male if he insists, all right? So this is a behavioral adaptation that has occurred over evolutionary time to work just fine. What I'm trying to say about all this, and still focusing on mammals, is that even in mammals, the female will only accept the male when she is ovulating. What does that tell us? That fertilization, that intercourse, sexual intercourse in other animals is strictly for reproduction. Strictly for reproduction. It's strictly business. You know, it's always about the progeny. It's always about the next generation. So that really, if other animals would somehow, we could explain contraception to the other animals, they would say, you're crazy, you're out of your mind. This is only for reproduction. How can I prevent reproduction? You know, so the whole instinct of the species is geared toward reproduction, strictly speaking. Yes, Emma?
Is it true for in humans when the female's on the period, the males know when she's on her period?
I've heard that anecdotally, that some men can detect, all right? They're called pheromones, the pheromones that are supposed to be exuded by, we all have pheromones, the male and the female, but I haven't seen any scientific evidence of it, not that I look for it, but I've heard anecdotally that some men can detect when some women are ovulating or not. But it's anecdotal, meaning that I haven't seen the scientific evidence. Maybe someone knows more science about this. But on the artificial side of things, I think that perfume is along those lines. Okay, but that's, again, a behavior, right? It's a unique human behavior. We don't see any other animals using perfume.
I think it used to happen more in the old ages when we didn't clean ourselves on a daily basis.
There you go.
Because when you shower, you increase your oil,
Right.
your own odors.
Odors, natural odors,
so,
yeah.
I think that is pretty much lost throughout the years.
Yes.
Because it was mentioned to us when we were, when I was in medical school.
Yes.
But
earlier on, yeah.
I believe that it is related to the fact that we don't have, we shower on a daily basis. We're not like
exactly. Exactly, yes. Or water was less available and so forth. And so there's more hygiene in general, even the introduction of soap. That's, yeah, but that's musk, right? And we know that musk is mammals, all mammals exude musk, and that is a sexual trigger for males in general. Again, I mentioned before that for mammals, the typical scenario is the harem. In other words, is polygamy out there. And that's the normal scenario for most mammals. A few are monogamous, like a few in birds, but the standard pretty much is the harem. And again, from the perspective of only reproduction, it makes sense because the females will be ovulating at different stages, and the male can just go around and be fertilizing the female, so that on average there will be a pregnant female in the harem all the time, meaning that it's just favoring the progeny, it's favoring reproduction, because we know that natural selection is going to be constantly acting against the progeny, right? The newborns. So it's all geared toward reproduction. It's all geared toward the next generation. In the human, we are unique in that the female accepts the male, even outside of ovulation. Her libido may be somewhat decreased and so forth, because we also know that the libido is a little higher on average during ovulation. It's more estrogen. But you see the human will engaged. Right? The human will engage in accepting the woman, accepting the man, even outside of her ovulation. which technically, if she's not ovulating, then she's infertile for that particular time, right? And that's where, excuse me, we're going to pick up on that with NFP, because that is the advantage, if you will, at the natural level, the natural advantage. Now, having said all this, I know at least of one possible exception that is also behavioral, that is in the chimpanzee, which the chimpanzee female will allow herself to be mounted by the male when she's not ovulating, but it's a survival instinct, which is this. It turns out that chimpanzees are really very aggressive, and the male is extremely aggressive and will be very aggressive physically with the female. And at some point, some female figured out that if she allows herself to be mounted by the male, she drains the male of testosterone and tones down his aggressions. All right, so she gets less beaten up and less bitten. Actually, they literally bite, and they have big canines. You can see the skeleton of the chimp that we have out here with the big canines. All right, so she gets less beaten up if she allows herself to be mounted by the male. Of course, a mature male is always desirous because he's producing testosterone, a normal male, all the time, right? But you see, it's a behavioral adaptation, okay? And then also because mammals and primates in particular were very copycat, we imitate the older ones in the clan. Then the mothers actually teach the daughters that behavior, so that when they become the young females, the young mature females for this alpha male, they will do the same because that's what they learned from the mom. And it works for them, and it maintains a balance then in the clan of that alpha male with his females, okay? And so, again, that is a survival instinct and survival mechanism, but you can see it's kind of out of its force. We can't really say that the female chimp has a full will to accept the male because this is going to be a loving, intimate relationship, you know, a lifelong together, forming a partnership, like humans do, or are supposed to do. All right. All right. So because of that, we really say that humans don't really reproduce in the sense that animals reproduce, because it's not strictly for the purpose of generating a new progeny, but rather we procreate, right? We humans procreate. And so when we introduce the language of procreation, we are now opening to the spiritual reality, right, of being co-creators with God. Also because the progeny that we humans produce are not just animals, they're human beings. The progeny of humans is also human, which involves the possibility of God granting a soul, right? And therefore, there are two sets of creators, if you will. The husband and wife is one set of creator, but they're more at the organic level, passing on the genetic inheritance. But God is also a creator of that new human by way of the spiritual soul. So you see the spiritual dimension entering into the equation, so that in the end we can say in a very real sense, combining our faith with our reason, that in that sexual intimacy of the husband and wife, there are three who are in that intercourse. It's the two of them and God, who is granting a soul if there is a fertilization. Mm-hmm. And so it spiritualizes human sexual intercourse to the ultimate level, which is just amazing that God is actually literally very present at that moment and pleased to grant a soul to this new individual. All right. All right. Some other aspects also is the whole aspect of being naked. All right. Let me see if it's here. Okay. Yes. The whole aspect of being naked. Again, when we look out the window, we see the rest of nature naked and walking around naked and have no problem. But we humans have a problem with that. In other words, no normal human being goes out in the street naked, all right? Normal people who just don't do that unless they're little tiny babies or very small children in Europe at a beach or something. But normally we walk around dressed, even minimally dressed, and it typically covers the sexual organs. So there is a pudor, there is a natural thing in our souls and our conscience to not walk around naked, and it's not just because it's cold or anything like that, even in the warmest day, right? So we go to the argument of the love that we have for one another, which is a natural thing. We love people along the way in many different ways. Our parents, our siblings, friends, family, even the respect that we have for a professional relationship, whatever. But these different levels of love, they're always like covered love, they're always clothed love, except for the married love, which is naked love. In other words, they share that nakedness with one another. And whereas at first there may be a little bit of inhibition, whatever, at some point they get used to one another's nakedness. In other words, it's natural, and it's okay for spouses to become used to each other's nakedness, even if when they're not making love, all right? It's part of the deal, it's part of the intimacy, right? So that the physical intimacy is this naked intimacy also covers the psychological. In other words, there's the bearing of the heart, if you will. When a couple is sharing their physical nakedness, they're also sharing some of their interior, some of their beliefs, some of their values, all right? The love that they share. So I call it's two naked bodies and two naked hearts also. The hearts open up to one another. This is natural. This is how it should be. It doesn't always work that way. Or if the openness is not 100%, maybe one is opening more than the other to each other, then that's going to cause problems. We see also that whereas in the rest of nature, and again, sticking with mammals, the standard is the harem, so that the females somehow tolerate each other for this one alpha male, and they're kind of okay with sharing their male with each other. In the human, it's not that way. Typically, the female is not okay in sharing her male with another female, all right? And vice versa too. When that intimacy is shared with a third party, with a third human, whether it's the man or the woman, there is a sense of betrayal that is very deep and very hard to heal, if ever, when there is that betrayal. So when the nakedness is shared with a third person, whether man or woman, all right, the betrayal that sets in is horrendous. And we can only imagine what, and the havoc and the chaos that it has produced in contemporary society with all the divorces and remarriages that have occurred in our contemporary society, which is now truly by the numbers this epidemic. I mean, if 60% of the population had the flu, we would be a very sick nation, right? I don't even know what is considered epidemic, but I'm thinking that maybe 10% of the population with flu would be epidemic. We're talking about 300 million, 30 million people in the United States with the flu. It's probably epidemic, all right? And that's nowhere near the average for the divorce rate in the United States and in most developed countries, Europe and so forth. So that's an issue, that's a challenge. And it has been going on, and it's another one of these social challenges. But we see that naturally, instinctively, that sense of betrayal because that nakedness was shared with someone else. That tells us that it's not supposed to be that way in the human, whereas in the rest of mammals, it's okay because they're naked to begin with anyway, all right? And it's animals normally don't clothe themselves. All right, so these are unique things about human sexual intercourse that are pointing to a reality, all right, that we call the two dimensions of human sexual intercourse, which is the procreative dimension, which I've spoken about already. In other words, the possibility of having children, all right? That connects us with the rest of nature, no problem. But then there's this unitive dimension, the unitive dimension, which is the bonding that occurs between the couple of opposite sexes. Today we have to even go further and clarify that, okay? That it's a natural complementarity between the man and the woman. And so this bonding, this forming a lifelong project together, right? Or the desire for doing that is what we call the unitive dimension. And in the human, for the act of intercourse, of sexual intercourse, to be truly human, anthropologically speaking, fully and truly human, it should contain these two dimensions. You know, the desire for the unitive dimension and for the procreative dimension, all right? And that's what would make it a truly human act according to our species, as we have been designed, because again, it is very respectful of even beyond of the psychological, beyond the psychological, of the spiritual dimension of the human person, body and soul one. So that in that intimacy, it's not just two bodies that are coming together. Rather, it is two bodies, two hearts, and two souls that are coming together to form that life project. That's the ideal, right? And that's how it should be. Then we have the challenges of the life that we live with all the influences, positive and negative, including the upbringing and the ideology that has been promoted over years. I remember distinctly was a point that divorce was actually illegal in the United States. And then, of course, California has to be always innovative and invented this thing of no-fault divorce, right? No one is at fault because who is the state to pass judgment on the conscience of people? And just like the divorce, the marriage, the civil marriage is a legal contract between two parties, and it is a license, it is a contract sanctioned by the state, which historically you think of the marriage, why the marriage license, why does the state get into something as intimate as marriage to the point of making a contract between those two people called the marriage license? It was precisely to protect the woman from polygamy, from the man forming his harem, right? So that if a man wanted to have another woman, he would have to divorce the previous woman first and give her what is her due, which is namely the alimony and the child support if they were children, and then move on to, and then they would have to get a divorce decree, which is another legal document undoing the previous legal document of the marriage license. That's at the level of the state. So the state went as far as legislating marriage in order to protect the woman, basically, which was the one who was left with the children and the burden of raising the children. So at least on the fiscal aspect, for the man to give the woman minimally, at least fiscally, what she needs to raise the children and to raise herself and to continue living and so forth, which is the divorce decree. But then the state did not go as far as saying, well, you cannot divorce at all, because that would have been taking it too far. But then California came out with this other invention of no-fault divorce, where the state is not gonna pass judgment on who was right or who was wrong on this, because the typical divorce comes due to an infidelity. That's the typical. Not always, but that's generally the case, right? But bottom line, it was to protect the woman precisely from not falling victim to being in a polygamous relationship, where there are other women and this one man is taking care, if he does, of these other women, all right? So you see that there has been a lot of evolution also, but that evolution social evolution has influenced the mentality of today, whereby people do marry and divorce and remarry and redivorce and so on and so forth, you know, not getting into what that intimacy is supposed to be to begin with, which is this forming this lifelong project together. Okay, I think I've said enough about that, the unitive and the creative dimensions, right? These should go together, and basically I use the example of a coin just to maintain the integrity between the unitive and the procreative dimensions. They should be both together in the act of intercourse, and I use a simple analogy of a coin. think of so many different coins that are in the United States, in the world, so many different coins of different kinds of metal, different shapes, different value, right? So many different kinds of coins in the world. But there's one characteristic that holds for all coins, regardless of what value it has, what size, what if it's antique or modern, what metal it's made out of, or what material. All coins have two sides. They have two sides, heads and tails, right? All right. And so those are the two dimensions which should be part of the intimacy of the couple, of the sexual intimacy. Now, to separate those two sides of the coin, we could potentially separate the two sides of a coin if we take a laser beam and cut the quarter down the middle, all right? But in the process of doing that, we destroy the coin. So we have done violence. And that's what I'm saying, that analogically, when we separate the unitive from the procreative dimension, we have done violence to that sexual intimacy of that couple, all right? Or they have done violence to it, because it's not supposed to be separate. They're supposed to be united for that act to be truly human and not just an animal thing. Yeah, okay, because otherwise it's by the instinct, right? All right, so having said that, that allows for us to make a judgment on contraception that because it separates those two events or those two dimensions artificially is doing violence to the act of human intercourse. See? So when you think about it, conceptually, contraception allows for the unitive aspect without the procreative aspect, because it's focused on purpose to deny or to suppress the procreative dimension of human intercourse. Maintaining the unitive, at least at some level of mutual selfishness or whatever, or even if there's a bonding, a real, true, honest bonding between the two, that they are excluding on purpose the other dimension, which is the possibility of bearing children. The possibility, because whether the children actually come or not, whether there's actual fertilization and gestation and birth, many other factors have to kick in, right? But at least the desire or the possibility is being denied with the contraception, all right? And with the direct or non-therapeutic sterilization. All right, so this little background first is mostly on, like I mentioned, the uniqueness of human sexual intercourse for it to be truly human and the serving of God's will and God's presence. So now we can look at contraception itself and direct sterilization. And we will, after we study the biological or clinical aspect of it briefly, then we'll be able to do a bioethical analysis and come to a conclusion. So with regards to contraception and direct sterilization, I'm focusing on the intention to avoid children, right? Without serious reason. Without a serious reason. And this aspect of just a functional definition that I'm using for contraception is essential when we get to NFP. Because again, natural family planning, people say, the couple say, well, this is natural, this is not artificial, so it's not contraception. Be careful, because the intention could still be contraceptive and they're using natural means, all right? So it really is at the level of the intention meaning or the will of the couple. So the real challenge is that the default aspect of human sexual intercourse is that that sexual intercourse in principle should be open, should have the desire for children simultaneously with the bonding at every act, individual act of intercourse. Challenging because then we're going to say, well, does that mean that every couple has to have a child every time they have intercourse? That's going to be, a child every 9 months. or 9.5 months, whatever time she takes to recover, that's not what we're saying either. Because the issue here is the serious reason. In other words, there are serious reasons for avoiding children, ethically, morally speaking. And that's precisely that's why Humane Vitae is so prophetic and so human also, and so anthropological, in that in Humane Vitae, Pope Paul VI defines and accepts and promotes that there are serious reasons for avoiding children, a number of them, right? So that in fact, for some couples, and I would say actually for many couples, it would be irresponsible to have a child every 9 months. So that's the serious reason, is that you have a child already, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 or 20, okay? So that's the serious reason right there, on average, unless you're super rich and have all kinds of help to raise all these 20 children. And your wife can bear that too, literally speaking. But there are definitely serious reasons, but they have to be serious, not frivolous. And that's when avoiding children for that particular time in the marriage is justified. It's unjustified, and it is the moral, ethical thing to do. The challenge is going to be then in the behavior, in the how, in the avoidance, in the how the children are avoided. Not by artificial means, which tries to exclude the possibility absolutely and to have absolute control, but rather to use the natural means, which allows for the possibility of God to intervene, even if the couple doesn't want the child. So it remains open. It remains open. NFP remains open to God's interaction. All right. It does say, so contraception, you can see, I'm kind of going to the bottom line here, but contraception seeks to have absolute control over the relationship of the couple, of their sexual intimacy, so that it is strictly for the pleasure of it, for the unitive aspect. That's the challenge, and that's the what is wrong about contraception and direct sterilization, is that it seeks to have an absolute control. It precludes, it puts God outside of the equation. Okay, so I see here I've listed only some of the serious reasons for avoiding children, all right? Typical one, of course, is finances. They're still young, they're getting established, they're still studying their careers, et cetera, et cetera. Or it could be something as relocation. It's very inconvenient right now. We really wouldn't have the time to give to a child. We're relocating. At some point I heard that the average American family relocates, to another city altogether, not just moving to a different place in the city, but to another city, on average, every 6 years. It's incredible. There's a very high mobility in the United States. Maybe things are a little more stable now with the internet and computers and working remotely and so forth, but sometimes the husband has to travel quite a bit, all right? And so relocation is a real issue that has to be taken seriously, or it can be that it's really just not ready emotionally to raise children. We have to respect that. Other reasons, there could be health reasons involved. They already have many other children, etc. Each couple can think, but it has to be, honest. The first people we have to be honest with is ourselves. And the next people we have to be honest with is our partner, our spouse, who is my other self, is the person that I'm forming a life project together. So let's really consider, is this next child going to be a real burden right now that we cannot give him or her the proper attention they need? Or is it because we want to do another trip around the world, or we want to get the third car, or change to the new car, et cetera, or get another yacht? What are the priorities? What are the priorities? Okay, and that's why it's important. And that's why lifestyle also fits in, because we are already accustomed to a certain standard of living, and we don't want to compromise on that standard of living. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so it requires that mature conscience, which is what the couple should have when they marry anyway. But I understand that this is kind of ideal. right? All right, so with this background, let's move into now the clinical aspect of contraception and direct sterilization a little bit, because always this, the bioethical analysis that the church tries to do is evidence-based, right? So we look at, I'm going to focus now on artificial contraception from the medical, clinical, biological side. We can say there are three types of contraception, three types or three categories, either mechanical, chemical, or surgical. And many times it's a combination of these, all right? On the more mechanical side, the male and female condoms, you realize there's also a female condom. It's not as popular, not as comfortable, et cetera, but there's also a counterpart female condom. There are also caps and sponges. Typically on the woman, you'll see that the vast majority of these contraceptive devices or mechanisms are on the woman, right? It's the female body that has to prevent, because the man is not getting pregnant. Exactly. And so we can see right away that the balance is not balanced. It's always skewed against the woman, right? Always the burden is going to be on her. So diaphragms, IUDs, which I also need to mention briefly that there are some of these that also are seen as contraceptive, but can also act as an abortifacient if there's breakthrough ovulation and already the endometrium is inhospitable because of the contraceptive device, and then it will there will be a failed implantation. The embryo will fail to implant. Well, that's an abortion. That's not contraception, which also raises the bar to another level, right? And the IUD can do that because it renders the endometrium inhospitable, in addition to trying to prevent conception. On the chemical side, the estrogens or the progestins, the pill, which is, I understand, by far the most popular, the most widely used contraceptive, not only in the United States, but in most of the Northern Hemisphere anyway, is the pill. Or something called the mini pill, smaller dosage. But there are also dosages that can be injected, subdermal or patches that are more longer lasting, a month, 2 months, 5 months. I think some are up to a year. I'm not really sure, but these are longer lasting, slow release. Obviously, all this is on the woman, right? On the surgical side, we got vasectomies are on men and tubal ligation on the women. Basically, is tying the tubes. In the men is the vas deferens, the tubes that are in the scrotum area, and in women is the eustachian tubes. In principle, or theoretically, these tying the tubes, these vasectomies and tubal ligations are reversible in principle. In practice, it's a different story. The first consideration is the fiscal consideration. It costs several $1,000s. Typically, these are elective surgeries, so they're not necessarily paid by insurance, several $1,000s. So that's the first consideration. To reverse it is another several thousand, with never 100% guarantee that they're going to work right. They're going to restore the fertility. And the second consideration is also painful because there's pain involved. The one time, the second time, there's also the pain involved. The other consideration is clinical in the sense that because it involves sealing those tubes back together, at the clinical level is called anastomosis, right? Sewing back, imagine literally sewing back these tubes that are barely visible, they're very tiny. It can leave scarring, especially on the inside, which will then might prevent either the sperm from getting to the egg, or if there is fertilization, now the embryo can get stuck there, and typically it can cause it to an ectopic pregnancy for the woman. Again, the danger on the woman, always on the woman. And so there is a health issue, which is not proportionate either. It's much more risky for the woman to get the ligation than for the man to get the vasectomy, all right? But many men prefer the woman to get the ligation because it's not manly to get the vasectomy. So we see that it's uneven, totally uneven terrain in the dynamics, both at the physiological level and at the psychological level, when it comes to contraception or direct sterilization. Typically, the burden is on the woman because at the end of the day, she's the one that is getting pregnant. All right. Now, with regards to risk, still staying on the clinical aspect, no contraceptive means is going to be 100% effective, right? The average is between 97 to 99%. So depends on the method. And this percentage assumes perfect and consistent use, which again is seldom human behavior. So we can go from that percentage down. In real case scenario of a couple, whether they're married or not married, is never going to be 100%. What does this mean statistically? If you think about it, let's take the higher percentage. Let's say 99%. It means that on average, of 100 women who are on the pill, taking it every day, at the same time of day, etc., all right, every single day for years, on average, out of 100 women, one will get pregnant if they're having intercourse, of course. All right, so one will get pregnant on average, out of 100. You know, when you multiply that to 300 million people in the United States alone, that's a lot of women getting pregnant taking the pill every day. And that's what we call breakthrough ovulation, right? Because nature is so stubborn that nature wants to do its thing in spite of all the chemical insults that it's getting. And so that's something to consider. If this 100 women, no one got pregnant on the pill, then on the next 100, two have to get pregnant to average out one, to average. And if in 200, none got pregnant, then on the next 100, three got pregnant, and so on. So you can stack it either way you want, but these are the stats. All right. So psychologically, what happens? People think that because they're on the pill, they're safe and they're not going to get pregnant, and then all of a sudden they're pregnant. But they can't sue the pharmaceuticals because on the brochure that comes folded up into little tiny thing, you know, that scroll that is about this big in tiny print, it's maybe 0.6, 6 point font or something. Front and back, it says there that one of the risk is getting pregnant. The other one is dying from embolisms or clots or high blood pressure. So it's a lot of contraindications, and still that little paper gets thrown out and people continue with their behavior, right? But there's all this in there. I don't want to go through these in detail necessarily. As always, I'll save the slides later, but you can see there are serious risks involved here, and the risks are not just physiological, some are psychological too, all right? Yes, Emma?
What about there's a patient that has I forgot what it's called with the kidneys. I used to do ultrasound on them before. That is,
renal failure or?
No, it's very painful.
Polycystic kidneys?
No,
Kidney stone?
no.
Tampoco.
No, it's like
Painful kidneys, okay.
a blood disorder.
Oh.
Semi-lunar bowels.
Oh, okay.
I can't think of the diagnosis
All right.
right now, but they
Okay,
have
but it's
very
a physiological
severe,
condition, yeah?
Yeah, physiological condition.
Right?
And they get pregnant. That pregnancy is going to be very painful for them. Is
see.
it bad for them to prevent pregnancy because they
No,
have a condition?
They may actually have a moral responsibility to avoid pregnancy, but it's in the how. In other words, if a woman was always fertile, all right, every day of the month, every month of the year, then we will probably have to revisit the issue of contraception from the theological perspective. But it turns out that the woman is not fertile every day of the year, every day of the month, right? On average, it's one day. The narrow window of fertility is 24 hours because that's, on average, the maturity of the human egg, of the ovum. But then, because the sperm can remain alive inside the female tract for up to 5 days, then we expand the window to 5 days. And then if you want to leave one more day as a safety margin before and after, that makes it 7, which is 1/4, right? It's 1/4 of a month. It's 1 week out of a month. What I'm trying to say by all this argument is, even with the margin, on average, a woman will be fertile 1 week out of every month during her fertile years, or infertile 3 weeks out of every month. So it means that if she has intercourse every day during those 3 weeks, she's infertile because there's no egg to fertilize. You see? So it comes down to the discipline of not having the intercourse during that week of fertility, which will further come down to her trying to establish when is her time of ovulation. That's the whole thing about NFP. I give you the course in NFP quickly.
And if the male is infertile too, and the female is infertile,
Well,
it's not their fault.
Exactly. If it's not their fault and they're infertile for a number of reasons, then that's, they can still desire to have children. And that desire may happen because, again, when we talk about NFP, we'll talk about these so-called infertilities that all of a sudden she's pregnant after she's not thinking about getting pregnant anymore. All right? It does happen. But anyway, I keep introducing NFP, which is a whole other lecture, but you can see that what I'm trying to say is if it were the case, hypothetically, that a woman is always fertile, like the man, for example, like she's producing eggs every 24 hours, right? Like some animals do, then we would have to revisit the whole issue of artificial contraception because she's fertile all the time. There's no window of infertility, right? There's no possible way that can, but it's inhuman to think that she should have a child every 9 months. But it's not the case. Thanks be to God, there is a cycle, just like in all the other mammals, there's a cycle, all right? So what the Catholic Church is saying is, then let's take advantage of that cycle for the benefit of the couple. But it has to be done maturely, responsibly, etc. Okay? So physiological issues are a separate case. I'm talking about normal, standard, the majority of the people. All right, so all this just to say that no artificial contraception is 100%. In fact, there's the only thing that is 100% to avoid pregnancy is celibacy. It's no intercourse. That's the only thing that is going to be, all right, safe if you want, or that will have 100%. All right, let's move forward from here so we understand the clinical aspect. We can go now to the bioethical analysis. We can see that contraception acts directly against the procreative dimension. So it separates. It allows, it allows for the actual possibility of the couple separating the unitive from the procreative. They take a laser beam and they cut through the coin in the middle. So analogously, what the contraception is doing, it is undermining that sexual experience for the couple. All right? They're doing violence, whether they realize it or not, because I understand also that many couples don't go anywhere near the depths that I'm going into in their relationship, in their intimacy. They just want to be together, all right? And they want to bother about the thinking and the process and what's happening and the sharing that is natural, because it's a very powerful, that sexual intimacy, it's a very powerful, it's a very serious thing. So what happens with artificial contraception? It establishes that radical separation between the unitive and the procreative. I'm trying to see if I had the slide here. No, I didn't have it, but I had it in another class. Let me bring it up for a moment. So the things that artificial contraception do to the relationship to start undermining the relationship and to start edging toward the eventual separation and divorce and infidelity and all this, all right? It just sets the stage for that because it allows them just to concentrate on themselves or on each other's pleasure without the consequences, the serious consequences of the possibility of conceiving. So let me go here for a moment and look at a slide that I have in another course that is also contraception. No, sorry. I went to the wrong slide. Yes, lecture 8, sorry. Here we go. All right, let's look a little bit at some of the downside of contraception and how it is so unfair on the relationship, right? Whether the couple is aware of this or not. The first thing is what I'm calling a libido differential. You know that in psychological terms, libido is just a sexual desire, which is natural for men and women, and it has a hormonal basis that is activating the sensors in the brain for desire, the natural heterosexual desire that we all have at some point. But you notice that whereas the mature man always has that libido, if he's a normal male and producing testosterone on a daily basis. On the female, the woman, it is different because the woman is cycling, and so naturally her libido will undulate according to the ovulation cycle. And it's natural, it's logical for the woman to feel a greater desire for intimacy while she's ovulating, because that simply is backing up the whole biology of the act, right? So that when she's not ovulating, she would naturally have less desire. But with contraception overrides this. Because then the man, whether it's the boyfriend or the husband, can say, well, you're contracepting anyway, or we're contracepting, so why don't you give yourself to me if you can't get pregnant anyway? I see? So you override is disrespectful of her natural cycle, her natural flow. Okay? So because of the libido differential, contraception is disrespectful and typically against the woman. Also, that act, which is supposed to be a very intimate, very serious, you notice that normally it's not down out in the middle of the street either, all right? Remember one time reading in the news years ago, somewhere up in, it didn't happen to be in Scandinavia, for some reason, a couple was having sex in the middle of the day in the park. And the policeman comes out saying, what are you guys doing? Says, oh, I'm sorry, we just got carried away. The couple said they realized they're in the middle of the park, in the middle of the day. Okay, we got carried away, but it was so abnormal because normally, there are inhibitions to do that. It's something that normally the couple does behind doors and so forth because it's so powerful. And yet, it's not like watching a movie where people naturally go and watch a movie. It's not supposed to be the entertainment that is falling into by way of the contraception. It just makes it an intersection. Okay, so what do you want to do tonight? You want to go to a movie? No, let's have sex instead. All right? It turns it into a type of entertainment. It can't do that. And typically, the burden on the woman. The mentality at the social level. The mentality is to avoid the children at all costs. So the children are something to be avoided. It's an epidemic, it's a plague, it's a pathology. It's wrong to be pregnant. Mm-hmm. It promotes that mentality. And not to mention the STDs. I had another slide that talked about the STDs, the sexually transmitted diseases. We are in the United States, we are at an epidemic level with the STDs. It is epidemic. The four big ones, syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and HIV. They're all at epidemic levels. It's in the millions. I had another slide there just on the, see if by chance it's still there. I think yeah. By the numbers from the CDC, the Center for Disease Controls and Prevention. Okay, which is the federal government branch that takes care of tracking the health statistics of the nation. From 2017, because they're always 1 year late, it takes them a year to compile all these stats, but these are the stats for just a year ago, all right? Chlamydia, almost 2 million, 1.7 million, just in 1 year. Gonorrhea, 500,000. HIV, 38,000. Syphilis, 31,000. This is not a historical, this is not a biblical disease only. All right? It's a current disease. When you add up all these numbers, 2.3 million.
And these are new cases?
Yeah, this is just in 17. Okay. Now, when we look at, I also looked up the total population of the US for 2017 so that we compare apples to apples. It was 325 million people. So when we do the math on the 2.3 million out of 325 million, right, it comes out to about 1 in every 14 Americans has an STD.
Right.
This includes children because 325 million is the total American population. So that's 1 in 14 Americans has an STD, as we are talking right now. Okay, and it is a geometric expression. It is still in a log phase. This is logarithmic numbers. In other words, by 18, it would be further up. And by 19, it's going to be further up. And this correlates when we trace this historically to the 50 years or so. Let me see, 1960 was the approval, the FDA approval of the pill. So we're talking 60, almost 70 years. It just correlates the STDs with the contraception very tightly because it allows for that possibility, the couples thinking that they're safe.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
If a pregnant mom has an STD, does she automatically have to give C-section instead of vaginal birth? So the baby won't come out with the STD?
I don't know. Well, so I think it depends on the STD actually, because some STDs can actually be transmitted at birth. I think that HIV is one of them because of the literal blood contact. But I don't know. It's a clinical question. Anyone have more insight on that? Not all STDs require.
I think it's a particular infection, streptococcus, I think. There was something else, but it not necessarily has to be a C-section, but it has. So it depends on the specific
Herpes.
Yeah, if it's not like an active disease, but there is one particular one that is definitely an indication for a C-section.
For C.
So they don't automatically get the STD while they're in the womb?
No.
No, it's in the birthing. Yeah. But some can be transmitted. How about chlamydia? I think, does chlamydia require C-section? I don't know, because that's the most prevalent. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, but so these are, some can be transmitted, right? You have the HIV babies, HIV newborns, because that is at the viral level, so that is transmitted to from the mom to the child. All right, so you see, these are the challenges that are being introduced in our society, and they're there for decades now, simply to get away with the behavior, with the irresponsible behavior of trying to truncate and put out of the equation the possibility of the procreative dimension. Has had all kinds of negative social consequences in our society for decades now. So, I mean, to talk about not using contraception, they think that someone is coming out of the moon or something because it's so totally countercultural. So this whole issue of control, right? That the more control we have, the more control we want. It's a natural thing. And contraception feeds into that. So it's a consumer thing. It's the ones who are selling it and promoting it are very aware that it's a consumer thing, that the people desire it, and so they're going to put it out there. And that's why that legalization of contraception back in 1960, the FDA approval of the pill for contraceptive means is a horrible thing that has happened to American society. And of course, once it happens here, the rest of the world copies it because that's a standard of modernity. That's how contemporary people, and that's another flag and bastion for the liberation of women, which we see the burden again falling on the woman once again, right? Yeah. Right. So in addition to all that, we can also talk about, just from the clinical aspect, from the medical aspect of contraception. And it was actually Dr. John Haas that I heard promote this several years ago at the National Catholic Bioethics Center in Philadelphia. I was associated with, still am, but I was there full-time several years ago. Dr. Haas, John Haas, is the director of the NCBC. Anyway, the argument is this. The naturally normal medical practice is for healing, right? It's for healing. So it's conceptual, but I think it's a very strong, valid argument. So it's for healing. And yet for contraception, or let's say a direct sterilization, is to render healthy organ inoperative. Is to block the normal function of a healthy organ. It's the only case that I can think of in medicine where the intervention, whether it's chemical or mechanical or surgical, is directly targeted to healthy organs, to render healthy organs inoperative, all right, and to not do their function. I really can't think of another case in medicine where this happens. You would think that these doctors are suable for malpractice. But if the patient, which is also a client, wants it, then as long as they sign the consent form, somehow they're protected from, the medical profession is protected from malpractice because the patient wants it. But if I walk into a clinic and say, doctor, please cut off my arm. It's a healthy arm, and I cut it off, please, because it's working fine. Doctor says, please, go back to the insane asylum. All right. How about if I sign the form? No, still won't do it. But for contraception, we allow it. And so you see, it's that whole justification of the behavior, come whatever may, come hell or high water, we're going to get away with what we want to do because we want it. All right. And it's this mentality is an absolute, again, it's an absolute interpretation of patient rights. But if we were to be honest, medically, clinically, it's a mutilation. So it's bad medicine. But we have it, okay? So very challenging. It's been in society for decades now, very entrenched. Now, having said all that, we make a distinction with therapeutic sterilization or indirect sterilization, which may be justified. Again, there is a serious reason. So when we look at indirect sterilization or therapeutic sterilization, then we have to look at the principle of double effect, okay? And right after this, we'll take a little break so that then in the second part, we can go into in vitro fertilization. So double effect. Double effect is this. First, there are two simultaneous effects of a single act. One single act will have a good effect and a bad effect. How do we decide beforehand whether we may or may not engage in that action? So two simultaneous effects, one is ethically correct and the other one is ethically incorrect, immoral, which we should avoid. If it's only the bad effect, it's a no-brainer that we should not do that act, right? Because if it's only a bad effect, there's no justification. But many times in life, it happens that there's a good effect and a bad effect. In order to be justified for the action to be overall, to be an ethical action, to be okay to act this way, all right, is by this application of the principle of double effect. So these 5 conditions must be met, all 5, not just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of them, but all 5 need to be met in order to proceed and go forward in an ethical way. So the first condition is the act must be done, must be good in itself or indifferent, morally indifferent, the act. In other words, it's not an intrinsic evil. It's not an intrinsic evil, all right? So the act itself is either neutral or morally good, ethically good. Again, within the context of a therapeutic sterilization. And the classical case is a mom who is pregnant and she develops cancer of the uterus, all right? So what is indicated is a hysterectomy. So the act in itself is good or indifferent. Secondly, the good effect must not be obtained by means of the evil effect. Sticking with the case of the cancerous pregnant uterus, to decide whether to do hysterectomy or not. If the uterus were not pregnant, the indication would still be a hysterectomy with a cancerous uterus. You see? So it's not that the good effect, healing the cancer, is because that unborn, because the pregnancy is going to be lost, because the unborn is going to die. Because even if there was no pregnancy, the indication is to remove the cancerous uterus, all right? So the good effect does not flow through the evil effect. The evil effect is that the unborn will die by removing the uterus. The evil effect must not be intended in itself. Must not be intended or desired. In other words, I, as a medical doctor, I'm dealing with my patient who is a pregnant mom and she has a uterine cancer. My intention is to get rid of the pathology to heal the cancer. My intention is not to kill the unborn. The unborn will die in the process, but my intention is not to kill the unborn. In fact, if I were able to save the unborn, I would do that. So it depends on gestational age, but I cannot let my patient progress in her pregnancy for months, risking her life, because that cancer may spread and metastasize and then kill the patient, all right? So it's a serious pathology, it's a life-threatening pathology. My intention at no point is to kill the unborn. If I could save the unborn, I would. All right, proportionate grave reason, in other words, life for life. This is not just to take care of her acne or something like that. You know, this is a cancerous uterus. In other words, it's a disease, it's a lethal disease that can kill the patient. And so it's life for life, the life of the unborn, the life of the mother. And this one is so obvious that many times it's excluded. When you look at the principle of double effect, many times you get the first four. But what is implied in these four, of course, that this is the last resort. If there's another means whereby we could preserve the life of the unborn, we would use that other means, okay? But this is the last resort. In other words, there's no other option for getting rid of that lethal pathology. So like I said, the 5 conditions must be met. And the classical example is a cancerous uterus. There may be others, but that's one that is used all the time. Yes?
But I think that for the mother, it must be horrible to know that
yes.
They sacrificed their child so she could live.
Exactly.
And I think that psychologically, she will have very serious implications the rest of her life.
Yes, she could, exactly. So this takes a lot of prepping, and at the end, it will be her who decides. She needs to consent to either the chemo or the hysterectomy or both, all right, on her own after a lot of informed consent, all right? Now, to the extreme that some moms have chosen not to undergo the chemo, and that is the case of Gianna Molla. I don't know if you've heard of Gianna Molla, but Gianna Molla was an Italian doctor, and I think she was OBGYN. Who is now Saint Gianna Molla, because she decided, so she was pregnant, she was already a mom, she had children, these are her 2 children before, all right? And she was pregnant, I believe, her 3rd child, I think she's pregnant here. And she developed cancer of the uterus, or maybe it was ovarian. Anyway, the protocol was chemo and radiotherapy, and she decided against. And precisely took the baby to term. The baby was born, a girl, I think a 3rd girl. Maybe this one's a boy, I can't tell. Anyway, the child was born, and the cancer progressed, and eventually she died from the cancer, all right? But the child was born. And so she was considered heroic for doing this, and she did it specifically for life. And her husband also supported her in it, which meant for him that he would have to raise 3 little ones on his own, okay? I don't know if he remarried eventually, I think not. But so this was so heroic that her cause for beatification was put through, went through, and eventually her cause for canonization, so now she's a saint. And at her canonization, where her widower husband and the kids were present, you know, at St. Peter's. So it's very touching, and she has become like a big patroness of the unborn, and a number of pro-life groups are named after her, and so forth. I've heard since, so when was her, I'm trying to find a date. It was, I saw some dates here. Okay, beatification in 94 and canonization in 2004, right? So 10 years later. So, and it was by John Paul II, probably one of the last canonizations he did. So this is in our current history, and I've heard that since a number of pregnant moms have gone this route.
Yeah, I have one. I
Yes.
know somebody in my brother-in-law family. She was a woman was pregnant, was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she decided to complete her pregnancy, and then she went for the double mastectomy
Right.
and chemotherapy. And she is fine, and she's cured from cancer.
And she survived, yeah?
Yeah.
Wow, tremendous, you see? So it's a risk, right? Because you never know, and the doctors will tell you, well, there's a 10% chance, there's an 80% chance, but those are statistics. We are not statistics, we're real life human beings. So that's a successful case, great, but she still, her intention was to give priority to her child as opposed to her own life or her health. And in this case, praise God, it works. Okay. But yeah, so this is very inspiring. Did she know? I don't know if she knew about Charamola.
I don't know, but I will tell her.
Yeah, ask her. Okay. So these are cases in life that are very inspiring because they're totally generous. Okay. So that's one case where in this case, you see it's a therapeutic sterilization. In other words, it is for the health of the mother. Now, a different case also, ectopic pregnancy, when the pregnancy happens in the tube, in the fallopian tube. There's a case where it's okay to remove the tube, and there's a case where it's not. In other words, you'd think it's paradoxical because a sapingectomy removes the tube with the unborn inside. So you understand a little bit of background further on. Go to there's the diagram here. All right. If this little embryo gets stuck at some point, for example, if there was a tubal ligation and anastomosis reconnection, there was scarring, and the little embryo got stuck somewhere along the tube in his or her journey of this first week, right? And that embryo is going to continue to do its thing, which is to become a blastocyst, and eventually the 12 ectoderm start implanting, and it will start implanting into, he or she will start implanting into the fallopian tube. That's a very wrong place to implant, because that fallopian tube, which is very tiny, is not designed to sustain a pregnancy. Will swell and can burst and cause a massive hemorrhage, because this area is very vascularized, a lot of capillaries, and it's a life-threatening condition for the mom, okay, to have an ectopic pregnancy. Of course, it happens early on. Sometimes she doesn't even know she's pregnant. Then she starts feeling the pain and so forth, and there will be also some biochemical signals in the bloodstream that can be detected. First of all, the very first indication is just expectant observation and management, meaning just to continue to observe her on a daily basis and monitor her, because a significant number of ectopic pregnancies resolve on their own. The little embryo eventually is discarded. Okay, will not implant, it's too late, will be discarded. It's the equivalent of a spontaneous abortion. But still is risky, okay, so she has to be observed every day and monitored and so forth. But I think it's about maybe 25% of them. I think I had it somewhere. But some ectopic pregnancies are resolved spontaneously. It's a good thing, but not all. So the ones that aren't, we have two options. Salpingectomy is removing the actual tube, in other words, where the embryo is impregnated, because at that point, because the embryo is impregnated in the wrong place, in the tube and not in the uterus, then that tube is, there's a pathology. There's a pathology. So the proper procedure, the clinical procedure, is to remove the pathology, is to remove the section of the tube. Of course, it's a sterilization, but it's an indirect sterilization. The side effect is that on that side, the woman will be infertile, okay? Because it's equivalent to a tubal ligation. That's the salpingectomy, is to remove the tube, and the embryo is inside the tube. So the embryo is not killed directly, but obviously the embryo will die, because the embryo cannot just live in the tube outside. The embryo will die, okay? It's very predictable that that embryo will die. But nothing is done to the embryo directly. It's the whole tube that is removed because of the pathology. The sad, drastic consequence is that an embryo is going to die. Now, there's another process that is chemical that is called salpingostomy. Salpingostomy is to treat the woman, or to go in and open the tube and scrape the embryo out, you see? So it's a very tiny surgery, if you will, to scrape the embryo out. That one is not ethically okay, because it's a direct intervention on the embryo. Of course, clinically for the mother, is more benevolent, because it doesn't render her, it may not render her infertile. But we also have to be careful, because it leaves the tube intact, but we have to see to what degree of intact, because scraping that tube, right, with the early embryo may cause scarring, which may compound the issue in a subsequent pregnancy. If there's scarring, then the subsequent pregnancy may get stuck there again. So we have to be careful, okay? But even before going into that, the fact that it's a direct intervention on the embryo is not acceptable, because it doesn't meet the requirements, some of the requirements of double effect. See? In fact, specifically number 2, which is a direct action on the embryo. In other words, the healing of that pathology, ectopic pregnancy, will come directly from scraping the embryo out. Okay? So it's the evil effect is the direct cause of the healing, which is a violation of the principle of double effect. So we cannot apply double effect to salpingectomy, all right? But salpingostomy, yes. Now, that's the tragic thing about this is that it seems like, you know, salpingostomy preserves the fertility of the woman, hypothetically, and the embryo is going to die in both cases anyway. In other words, in a salpingectomy, because the tube is removed and the embryo is inside the tube, the embryo is going to die anyway. So what's the big deal if the embryo is going to die anyway, if we at least try to preserve the integrity of the reproductive system of the mother, you see? And it's a very compelling argument. But it's an argument that is not taking into account that that embryo is a human being, as human as the mother. So if we were to reverse the case, hypothetically, it would be like saying, well, let's scrape off the mother off the embryo and let the embryo live. That is lunatic. That is not conceivable. You know, let's scrape off the mother off the embryo, away from the embryo, so that the embryo may live, hypothetically. I don't know how that could be done in real life situation. Let's say we take the embryo, we put him or her in an incubator and discard the mother. That's not sustainable. You know, that's not ethically correct. So the life of the embryo is as valuable as the life of the mother. So removing a pathology, yes, with the tragic consequence that the embryo will die, but the embryo was not killed. The difference between killing or dying. And it's subtle, but it's real, and it makes all the world difference in, at least for Catholic bioethics. Even though we see that salpingostomies are done more and more because it supposedly preserves the fertility of the woman. Okay, I talked about the pregnant mom who develops cancer also. So these are typical cases that come up now. And you can see that a secular interpretation of bioethics would approve of all these procedures, that we would not. In other words, it would be a direct attack on the human embryo to save the health of the life of the mother, but not applying really the principle of double effect. Okay, so we have challenges there from the Catholic perspective, and this is part of what makes a Catholic hospital less competitive than secular hospitals or non-Catholic hospitals, which would be okay with all these procedures, which can also be billable. All right, so on the fiscal end, Catholic hospitals cannot do any of these procedures, and they are then at a fiscal disadvantage to compete with other systems that are non-Catholic. Okay, so it's getting harder and harder at the level of the institution to sustain Catholic hospitals today in a secular environment on the fiscal part of things, because some procedures are offensive but are very profitable. That gives me a segue from one of the most profitable procedures that are in hospitals today and even clinics, which is in vitro fertilization. So let's break here and we'll come back. But we'll make it a little shorter, 10-15 minutes, because there's a lot of material to be covered there.
That was the reason why Baptist and Mercy could not
merge. Yes, exactly. In the 90s, I remember I was partly involved in that whole discussion. Yeah, very challenging, because then Baptists went on to become a whole system. It used to be just a standalone there in West Kendall. Stayed isolated and could not compete. So eventually it was bought by a system too, which in principle is a secular system. I forget how it's called, that system that bought Mercy Hospital, the Catholic hospital. But now that system has decided to abide by the ERDs, by the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services. So Mercy continues to be Catholic, even though it's not owned by the Archdiocese any longer. It's a beautiful thing. Okay.
Is that the same for Holy Cross?
Not Holy Cross, not, but it is for, that system has about 170 hospitals, a national system. And it has also Plantation Hospital. And more recently, they bought like Kendall Regional, which is on Bird Road and the expressway, the turnpike. All right. And so it's a growing system, and the upper echelon of that system has decided to maintain the Catholic identity of these hospitals. Yeah, absolutely.
Are they going to the cancer reproductive system?
Yes.
Because if there is a pregnancy, let's say, like a 6 months pregnancy,
right?
You know, that is potentially a
viable, absolutely,
child.
Yes.
So with that double effect, still.
Thank you for bringing it up. Yes, in fact, it was Baptists who had the record for viability, because normally it's around 24, 25 weeks, but they did one at 23 weeks, and the little girl survived. Okay, I think now it's like down to 22 or 21 weeks viability. It's fantastic, and of course, then that's indicated. In risking, I think it's where the 50% chance tips over in favor of being viable. They're tiny, they're all hooked up with little tiny catheters and tubes, all right? But they survive in incubation for the next 20 odd
because
weeks.
I heard another case that it broke my heart, because it was another young woman that in her late 20s,
right,
was pregnant, already had a child. She was diagnosed with cancer, and they terminated the pregnancy at 5 months.
Yeah, 5 months, imagine that. That was very viable.
So, you know, I was heartbroken.
Yes. Very sad. I even wonder why they did that. Was it here in the States? Or?
Yeah.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
No, they had plenty of chance to save that child.
That's what I thought, and that's what I was heartbroken, because they said, or wait another 4 weeks. What difference is going to make 4 weeks, you know?
Well, for the cancer, it could make.
But sometimes,
depends.
the process of a cancer, you wait for the insurance to approve your treatment, and
Yeah.
time goes by.
Yeah, that's the 4 weeks right there.
So you don't have any benefits of health insurance. You have to carry the cancer for that long.
Yes, it's true.
So,
it's very true.
You know.
Exactly. And it was alive, right? So it's very sad. And that's another downside of why, because it is legal, then it's the first thing that people think of. In the medical profession, typically it's the first thing they think. Certainly terminated pregnancy is legal anyway, so I'm not going to risk the life of my patient. Yeah, very sad, because they are definitely viable. Yeah. Okay, let's take that break now. Okay, welcome back, and the lights. And there's still a couple of things before we leave the issue of contraception. One that came up during the break, and another one that I still have here. We'll get to that. Let's see. And we were talking, oh yes, Plan B. Plan B, I also forgot to mention Plan B, which is a potential abortifacient. All right. Plan B is also known as the morning after pill. And the morning after pill can now be bought over the counter. And the intention is to act as a contraceptive. It's a large dose. It's actually, I believe, 2 pills, right? But it's intended as a contraceptive. It's a high dosage, essentially, of estrogen to suppress ovulation last minute, even after the intercourse, in case the woman has not ovulated yet, because the sperm, again, can reside, can live for up to 5 days. So the intention of Plan B is to suppress ovulation, but in the process, it also renders the endometrium inhospitable. And therefore, if there is ovulation and Plan B does not act as a contraceptive, it may also act as an abortifacient, because then the early embryo will not implant. Okay, so we have to be clear about Plan B that is sold over the counter. Still, as far as I know, the pill, the contraceptive pill, is still by prescription, right? But now this morning after pill can be bought over the counter in the, what do they call it? I think it's Women's Health or family planning section of the drugstores. All right. I would call it family counter planning. But anyway, that's available over the counter. And sometimes women don't realize that it's actually may cause an early abortion.
Father,
Yeah.
there's actually ability to, there's a doctor that created this protocol. So if people do take one of the pills and then they're supposed to take the second one and they panic and say they don't want to do it, they can call this number and it's staffed by nurses. And they go through what you where you can go to get the protocol to reverse.
Exactly.
To reverse it.
That's the key word, reversal. Doctors have figured out it's basically an antagonist to the estrogen, so that it binds to the receptors where the estrogen would bind, thus blocking out the estrogen, okay? And it's called abortion pill reversal. It's an actual protocol. You can see it. You just have to punch in the word abortion pill reversal. They have their site, and they have teams in different places of the United States. Little by little, it's getting more popularity. So if a woman has second thoughts about what she just did, which was to try to, well, she took the pill to reverse it, and there's a protocol now. The worst thing that can happen is that we won't work, and then the abortion did work, all right? But in the best case scenario is that the second dosage will be blocked, and she may be able to continue with her pregnancy. Okay, so yes, it's a fantastic pro-life thing, and it's called like that, just abortion pill reversal. They're naming it here rescue. I wonder if that works also. Maybe that will get to the site also. Yeah. Okay, so either one, abortion pill reversal or abortion pill rescue will work to get you to the site, okay? So these are tools to have, because sometimes you may be in contact with a woman who has regretted taking the morning after pill. Finally, well, what I had here was a brief history of the contraceptive pill. I don't know if, no, let me not go into, because already it's 11:45. I only have 1 hour to cover IVF. And there's a lot of material there. But I'll leave the slide. You can look at it, the bottom line. And here is a link to the encyclical Humanae Vitae, which was a flagship encyclical for the Catholic Church with regards to contraception by Paul VI in 1968. All right. But maybe next class, if we have some time, we can go over this a little bit. We're starting with Margaret Sanger and what chaos that caused in society. Let me move on to IVF, unless someone has any other question about the contraception and all that. No? All right. Let's go to IVF, because in an IVF situation, you can think of it as the converse of contraception. Here, one can have the procreative without the unitive. So it's a radical separation of the two. But now, it's on the other side, is having a child without having the sex, or having the sex and the child separately from each other. So being able to have a child with or without the sex. Let's see how this works. First, we have to look at the clinical and medical aspect of it, and then we'll do the bioethical analysis, okay? So again, I have the slides a little bit backwards here. Okay, we can start again here with our standard diagram of fertilization, and this is not in vitro. By definition, this is in vivo, in other words, in the live body of the woman. And so this is in vivo. In vitro, by contrast, and the word tells us exactly what it is that in vitro means that it is in glass, right? It's a reference to when the lab equipment used to be all glass for sterilization. Remember Pyrex or Corex and all that? Because then that those instruments and those materials, those dishes and everything were sterilized in the autoclave and reused and so forth. That was the time of the glass, but now we're in plastic, so now everything is plastic and disposable, and that way everybody can charge more for everything else that they're doing. Mm-hmm. And so maybe today it should be called plastico fertilization, but that doesn't appeal too much, so they left the in vitro stuff there, all right? But there's no glass to be seen anywhere anymore. All right, so this basically is manufacturing a baby in the lab. All right, it's very much a manufacturing process. It's extremely sophisticated and detailed, and to the highest clinical standards, of course. The sad reality is that we are manipulating human life to the hilt here. All right. So the in vitro fertilization clinic it all starts with procuring the raw material, which is the egg and the sperm, because that's what's going to be fused or united in the lab. To procure sperm is, again, at the human pragmatic level, no problem, because every ejaculating principle would have 100 million of them. And so men now sell the sperm, and sperm has been able to be cryopreserved, to be frozen for decades now. And so there's a whole market on buying and selling sperm. The men sell the sperm and the clinics buy the sperm. And if a man happens to have very potent sperm, then he can make a lot of money selling his sperm, okay? And so that's been happening a lot, and that goes into a catalog. And on the catalog, it will say everything about the man except his name and his address. It'll say the height, the weight, the hobbies that the guy likes, everything else is IQ for sure, whatever he has studied, because it's all eugenics. It's all about getting the best sperm possible, all right, for the money. And so the clinics, the in vitro clinics, have these catalogs where the women can buy sperm. That's if they're not going to use the sperm of the husband. And then on the woman's side, to procure the egg, that's a different story. Because again, that's more delicate, that's more difficult, precisely because on average, there's only one egg a month, right? So what do they do? The first thing, excuse me, because this industry is a trial and error industry, it's a hit or miss industry. So they start with excess of the starting material, and the starting material beyond the egg and the sperm is the embryos. So they also start with excess embryos to see if one or two implant and so forth. So they start with excess. How to obtain excess embryos? Well, they have to do excess fertilizations. In other words, they need excess eggs. So that's the hyperovulation or the hyper stimulation of the eggs. Typically it's Clomid, but any kind of fertility drug will stimulate the ovaries to try to mature, right? Not one follicle, but maybe 10, 20, 30 follicles at once. So 1 or 2 or 3 dozen. I have a cousin, she recently retired, but she worked in one of the systems as a social worker. And she said, Alfred, all the time, I'm seeing these women come with burst ovaries. The ovaries swell up like if it were a grapefruit. So intuitively, that's already a very dangerous situation. It's a risk to the health of the mother. It's painful to the life of the mother. If that ovary bursts, again, it's a situation of a massive hemorrhage. And she goes into emergency to try to save her life. And yet, women are doing this sometimes to sell their eggs. Because now, now the industry has gotten to cryopreserve the egg also. Okay, and so now one can buy eggs in a catalog. And what do? They target young women in college. Yes, you can find the advertisements, hopefully not here, but in any secular university, you can find the advertisements of in vitro clinics. soliciting eggs to donate the eggs. So now here's that the traffic is done. Here is how the human traffic is done. The clinics will seek donation of the eggs, all right? For a woman to undergo hyperovulation, just one cycle, and whatever they're able to retrieve, 1, 2, or 3 dozen eggs, whatever she ovulated in that one cycle, they'll go in with a syringe and suck them out. And then she will be compensated for all the pain and suffering and discomfort and risk of life. She will be compensated maybe $10,000. So they're not buying the eggs. You see, the eggs were donated, but they were compensated for the hassle. Now, if she happens to have a good GPA, then they may give her $20,000. And if she's also athletic and white and blonde and blue eyes, she may get $40,000 for her eggs. So it's just trafficking. Is what it is, but it's legal. All right, and that's how the in vitro clinics end up with excess egg and sperm. They mix them in the lab and they fertilize. And when the eggs are fresh, it's the ideal. Fertilize the eggs when they're fresh. Now you got what? You got zygotes. You got human zygotes. You got human embryos. So the couple wants one child, right? One child at a time, and then maybe we'll think about the second one or third, but they start with one. All right, so what happens? And it may be a couple, or maybe a couple of women, or maybe a couple of men, because they'll rent a womb, or it may be a single woman, or maybe even a single man, because if he can pay, he can have a child manufactured in the lab and gestated by a rental womb, and then have his child, all right? It's not illegal, and therefore it's legal, and as long as the money is there, they'll do it. So what happens? Let's take a hypothetical case. She ovulated a dozen eggs. The dozen eggs were fertilized. And let's give it even in the best case scenario, because we're going to think of things that are wrong. But let's think in the best case scenario of a married couple who are both Catholic, married in the church. I married them 10 years ago. And after 10 years, they say, Father, we can't have any children. You know, for 10 years, we've been trying. And we can't have them. So I say, don't do it, but they go to the in vitro clinic. Sorry.
Can you open the auditorium for me?
Well, I'm having a class now. Do you have a class?
No,
Sorry?
I have a visit, a track visit.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of the class.
You can't open.
No, I'm in the middle of the class. I need to program it. Sorry.
I did program this with the visit.
Okay, host security. Good. We're going to work it out now, but this has to get, okay? Sorry about that. All right, so she ovulated a dozen eggs. They were all fertilized, and now we have a dozen embryos in a Petri dish or a jar. And now leave it, please. And now she only wants one fertilization at a time, one embryo at a time, one child at a time. But because it's a trial and error thing, and no one knows exactly why, but the miracle number, the magic number is 3 to 4 embryos. 3 to 4 embryos are inserted. Well, first of all, they're incubated for 3 to 5 days to get them to the blastocyst stage, because zygotes don't implant, right? And so they have to incubate the embryo in an incubator in the lab at room temperature, at body temperature, in a medium that mimics the internal environment of the womb. And now at 5 days approximately, when they have the blastocyst, now they will attempt implantation. So they will insert into the woman an average of 3 to 4 embryos. Again, no one knows why, but on average, with 3 or 4 embryos, 1 implants. The other 2 or 3, what happens? They're discarded. They didn't implant. So what does that mean? Well, that was a spontaneous abortion, right? Because they were naturally discarded by a uterus, only 1 implanted. But it is an abortion, but it's not a natural abortion. It's not a spontaneous abortion, because there's nothing spontaneous, there's nothing natural about this process. Those embryos were inserted there on purpose, and at least the technician, and certainly the owner of the clinic, knew that on average, 2 or 3 were going to be lost for every implantation. They may not tell the mother this, okay? But the clinicians know, the industry knows that they're working on trial and error. So they're willing to risk the life of 3 embryos in order to save 1. So those are procured abortions.
And they have a soul, right?
They have a soul, of course, at the moment of fertilization. To me, that is the worst thing about in vitro, is that it is forcing the hand of God to donate a soul. Because again, God cannot be cruel. God would not leave an embryo without a soul, even if that embryo is in a petri dish in some clinic. You see? So they are literally forcing the hand of God to grant a soul, because those children are also victims. There's one even in my family. He doesn't even know about it. He's already an adult, because many couples don't tell. They grow up and they're not soulless. They're human beings like you and I. And they're walking around the streets now. They're in the tens of thousands of in vitro people who are walking around. Many of them don't even know it, which presents other levels of injustices in society when they start meeting each other and falling in love, and they don't know that they're coming from the same sperm or the same sperm donor. Yeah, it's insane.
Question.
Mm-hmm.
When this couple is trying to have a child, and the woman donates his own eggs and the husband
Right.
his sperm,
Right.
and why do they not allow the woman to try this? Why do they do it in vitro? It is more successful that way?
Exactly. It's actually more successful and easier for the clinic than to try, because they get better results that, say, artificial insemination, and they can charge more. Okay? But this technique has become so perfected, precisely is based on those excess embryos. They just keep implanting or attempting implantation until one finally takes, than to do the insemination, because many times, if it's on the husband's side, the sperm is not competent and so forth, so it's easier to even force. And there's an actual technique, it's called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, ICSI, intracytoplasmic. They actually put the sperm in a cannula, in a little glass, there's a glass needle, and they push it inside the egg and release the sperm inside the egg, literally, really forcing totally against natural selection.
In vivo?
No, not in vivo, in vitro, all in vitro, all in vitro. Yeah, this has to be done in the lab. This is all about manufacturing babies in the lab.
And do they charge for implantation?
Exactly. Well, different clinics rate different ways. So you can see it there. Here is the egg, the human egg. You can see the cannula here being with the sperm. Okay, and this other instrument here, this is actually a vacuum. This is a vacuum. This is a tube, all glass, right? So there is a glass thing. This is a tube. Of course, this is macro. This is about 10 microns across, right? So you can see that this is a micro photograph. And this here is a little tube that is blunt at the end and hollow, and is hooked up to a vacuum pump and makes an ever so slight vacuum to hold the egg in place. It's just sucking the egg. It's like having a crude way of doing this would be a tennis ball and a vacuum cleaner, right? You can put the tennis ball upside down, it will not fall because the vacuum cleaner is holding it in place. Okay, it's the same principle, but much more sophisticated. Imagine the sophistication of this pump to exert a vacuum here just to hold on. This is the cumulus. This is the zona pellucida. All right? And not sucking in the whole egg into the tube. Imagine the sophistication of control of that suction.
But Father, you said that zona cannot be penetrated. Right? And how come
What do you
that
mean?
one penetrated?
No, naturally. If there is fertilization, the zona has been sealed over. But all that is overwritten here. The whole point of the vacuum, my point here is that this instrumentation is extremely sophisticated. This needle here is a glass needle that is microscopic, and you can see it's slanted, right? To cut through the zona and through the membrane so as to release one sperm at a time in there.
If you don't hold the egg there, it will slide if you're pushing it with a needle. So
Exactly.
the vacuum
Slippery.
is holding the egg in place for the needle to penetrate it and then insert the sperm.
Exactly. So it's just holding it in place.
So the sperm that's going to fertilize, it's not like the most fit. It's just the first
Exactly.
that gets there.
Exactly. And that's another argument that I use. This is so against nature that it's a supreme injustice. It is denying this child being, on average, the most strong, the most healthy, vigorous child it can be. So it is denying natural selection to this child.
Exactly.
It's denying natural selection.
Because there's no natural selection.
Exactly. This is artificial selection. This is precisely because I can choose as many qualities as I want on the sperm and on the egg. So this is artificial selection on humans, which is called eugenics. It's eugenics.
A friend of mine
Eugenesia. Mm-hmm.
IVF. I didn't know, and then we became better friends.
Yeah.
And her son has a heart condition. I don't know what it is, but I know as he grows, he has to keep having open surgery.
Wow.
And when I found out she had IVF, it just like in my mind, I thought,
Could be.
I wonder if this is why,
Mhm.
because
It could be.
maybe the most fit sperm.
Yeah. Exactly. I haven't been able to put my hands on some studies, but now because there are literally tens of thousands of IVF children or adults throughout the world, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, that can afford this process, then there should be some statistics, robust statistics of a profile of some kind of, I've heard anecdotally that they tend to be drawn. It's mostly at the psychological level. They tend to be drawn in and not very friendly. They tend to be very intelligent, but not very friendly. So that's one profile that I've heard maybe coming out of IVF, but it's just anecdotal. I don't have the scientific evidence for it, all right? But certainly, this process is totally against nature, and that's why it's called in vitro, because it's a manufacturing in the lab. Now, I also have to point out that most IVF is not ICSI, okay? This is an extra case. This is a more sophisticated case, precisely when there is sperm incompetence and the couple still insist on using the husband's sperm. Mm-hmm. Typically, that's the ICSI. But most, because it's much more sophisticated, it costs much more also, all right? But the standard IVF is just one egg and a bunch of sperm thrown in the same medium. And whoever gets fertilized is the one that fertilizes, that's it.
And in that case, is the most fit father, or?
Not necessarily, it's the most fit of those 100 or those few that they throw in, so some of the selection that is done, which is artificial selection, is in the lab. The sperm processing is this. So the semen is spun down and the sperm is collected, a fraction out of the semen. And then sometimes a lab technician under the microscope, a light microscope, will select the sperm that he or she thinks is competent simply by the morphology, what we call the gross morphology, that it has a tail that is wiggling, But that's very crude compared to the biochemical sophistication that happens in natural fertilization. All right, because that sperm on the outside may look fit, but biochemically may not have enough acrosome, enough enzymes in the acrosome to penetrate the egg. Who knows? I mean, it's a very sophisticated, the process of fertilization in nature is extremely sophisticated. And it's not just physiological, it's also psychological. I'll give you an instance where you'll see two examples of how it is also very psychological, the whole process of fertilization in the human particular. Emma?
Father, when the sperm, can you have normal sperm and abnormal sperm together?
Yes.
Or no?
Yeah, because you have, absolutely. Each sperm, with no tail, with two tails, with a shorter tail, one is a stroke. That's why when they raise from the uterus or from the cervix to the ampulla, right? They don't all get there at the same time. And precisely, there's a selection process happening. In fact, I forgot to mention, here it is. The selection process against sperm is it's different. The selection process is about 100 million to 1, right? Because on average, a normal ejaculate should have about 100 million sperm, right? To round it off. And so only one fertilizes. That means that selective pressure against sperm in nature for the human is about 100 million to 1. It's the selective pressure against fertilization. So that's why on average, that is the most vigorous sperm mechanically and biochemically and everything else, because of the sophisticated environment, the microenvironment that is occurring for that fertilization to happen. All right? And so all that is obviated and put aside with in vitro fertilization. So you see there are many injustices that are built into the system. Of course, the industry is never going to tell this to the couple because then they'll run away as fast as they could. But no, it's all very pink and blue, baby blue when you walk into the clinic, and it's beautiful there. And what happens out in the lab is a different story altogether. Okay, but there's this super manipulation of the humans. Other things that can happen. So the failed implantations or abortions, all right, freezing and thawing embryos. What do I tell a couple when she comes and when they come and says, well, we had our child, father, but now it turns out that we have 8 embryos that are frozen and I can't have 8 more pregnancies, all right? What do I do with the 8 embryos that I have frozen? They put in liquid nitrogen, which is about minus 170 degrees centigrade. They're crystallized instantly, all right? But they're not dead because you cannot bring the dead back to life. When they're thawed, some of them survive the freezing and the thawing, so they're alive. They're in suspended animation. But these are human beings that are in suspended animation. And by the way, no one consulted with them. There was no informed consent here because an embryo cannot consult to be frozen or manipulated. So who has a right to freeze human beings just because they're tiny and they don't have anyone to defend them? You know, but now it's estimated, the research I did was about, it's already about 15 years old, 15, wrote a little article on in vitro back then. And back then, the only study that had been done, just counting approximately the number of frozen human embryos that were in the United States alone was 500,000. 500,000 human embryos frozen about 15 years ago. We can safely say that it's at least 1 million, because that's another thing. This industry is one of the most under-regulated industries in the US. They don't have to give account to anybody for anything. They don't have to say how many embryos they have frozen, except to their clients and whatnot, or anything. So they don't have to say their success rate even or anything like that. So we don't know exactly how many abortions are going in there. We don't know exactly how many embryos are actually frozen, but we can easily estimate that at least 1 million human embryos in the United States are frozen right now. Only in the US, not counting other places, Europe, etc. So it's becoming a huge social problem. What do we do with these 100 million people who are frozen, 1 million people who are frozen in these tanks, cryopreserved, and the couples, they don't know what to do because, again, because of the hyperovulation, it works on this excess. The couples cannot assume all that and absorb those embryos that are frozen. They're paying first an initial fee to have them cryopreserved, and then a monthly fee, which may be under $100 to $100, but over the years it starts adding up. At some point, what do couples do? They walk away. They abandon the embryos. So what does the clinic do? Periodically, they empty the tanks. They empty the tanks. If they have some kind of clinical compulsion, they'll send them to medical waste, which basically means incinerating them, or they just flush them down the toilet, down the drain, because it's just, you know, microscopic tissue.
Maybe they implant it in someone else and they don't tell.
That could happen.
No,
Now that's
no,
that.
Yep. For them, it's money, not a.
Yeah.
They don't have any moral. Exactly.
Exactly. There are no moral qualms about it, but that is actually suable because the couple wants the child that they manufactured and so forth, that they selected as perfect.
They're not going to know.
Well, they can because they can do a DNA test, right? So the industry will not do it simply because they're suable and because this industry at this point is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's one of the most successful industries in the medical field right now, all right? And therefore, they're not going to expose themselves because they know that they belong to the deep pockets. All right, so they're super careful about exposure, legal exposure, because they know they are deep pockets.
Actually, there's a movie, Father,
Hmm?
about this guy that he sells his sperm when he was in college, and then the company implants all the. So he had like 200 kids.
Exactly.
The movie is really funny, but it can happen.
Exactly.
So at the end, he put all the 200 kids,
Exactly.
different ages, and all the
Exactly.
like him.
The sequel to that is when these 200 kids start falling in love with each other
Exactly.
and having their own children, and then all of a sudden these children are abnormal because they come from the same sperm. The couples didn't know, nobody knew, the kids didn't know, and so you see the social problem. And that scenario actually happened in a clinic in the Midwest where it's a rural area and there are not too many of these clinics around, and this young couple was infertile, so they went to the clinic and they were successful in having their baby, but it was heterologous. In other words, the sperm came from a donor. I think the problem was on him, so the sperm was from a catalog. It happened that that sperm was very potent. This couple then, when they finally have their baby, they go back to their group. They have friends who are about the same age. There's another couple in the group who was also infertile, so they get the referral from the couple that has success. They go to the same clinic, they get implanted, and they use the same sperm, unbeknownst to them that it came from the same donor. And these kids grew up together. It happened to be a boy and a girl. They fell in love with each other, and they were both half brothers. So it has actually happened in real life already in the Midwest at one point. And we can expect this to happen more and more and more. So who has control over this, right? And it's eugenics. It's what it is. It's eugenics. But they call it in vitro fertilization. And I've actually spoken with some of these doctors, the two that have the two big clinics here in Miami. And I asked them, well, what about the unborn? What about the blastocysts? What about these early embryos? They said, well, that's tissue. That's just tissue. These are medical doctors, specialists, super specialists who obviously study embryology, all right, in much greater depth than I have. But they say, no, unless it is implanted, it's not a human because it's not implanted. So it's just tissue. How do you argue against that level of ignorance from these people who are PhDs and are super rich and are manipulating, and they're so happy that they're making all these infertile couples have children? One of them even has once a year, they have a big family reunion and all the couples come with their children. And they take a huge photograph with all the hundreds of couples that they have been so happy to give life to, give children to. They never mention the other hundreds that are in the tanks waiting to be implanted or to be given, donated to science, because now the couples walked away and now the industry has figured out a way to do with those spare embryos. They call them spare embryos, spare human beings. Who's a spare? These are spare human beings just in a tank. Well, now the industry, the in vitro industry, has figured out a way to make even more money because they never have enough, okay? The embryos that are abandoned, they're not legally human, right? They're not a legal person by the law, but they have to be something, so they're property, because they exist materially, physically. And by the way, when the couple divorces and they have in vitro, they have spare embryos, they fight for the embryos the same way they fight for the car and the house and everything else. It's happened with actors and the entertainment industry. He wants the embryo, but she doesn't want them, or back and forth, and they fight in court for the embryos the same way they fight for their other property. But if they're abandoned, then in the contract it says they become property of the clinic. So what does the clinic do with all the spare embryos, right? All right, so what they do now is they donate them to science, yes, to obtain the embryonic stem cells. That's where the embryonic stem cells come from, because it's the inner cell mass, right? That becomes the embryonic stem cell. But because they have done all the process of the in vitro and incubated the embryos and cryopreserved them, so they have spent money and resources on preserving these embryos, they donate the embryos to science, but then science compensates the clinic for the hassle of maintaining these embryos, cryopreserve and all that. So there comes the money back again into the clinic, and they're not selling the embryos because they're donating the embryos, but they're entitled to get compensated for all the hardship of maintaining those embryos, you see? So again, more trafficking, human trafficking. Here we have it. It's legal. It's in the millions of dollars. It's right in our backyard, happening right now.
Sorry, do this clinic have like a bioethics board? You have to have them.
Sure, but but what happens? The bioethics boards are typically going to be secular, pragmatic, utilitarian. They're going to be industry driven, all right? They're going to be the employees of the industry. Because the average couple on the street who is infertile, they don't know. They just want to have their baby, okay? And if they have enough money, they'll have their baby. So the board works, and what does the board check for bioethics? What's the bioethics? That they actually give the couple the child that they negotiated for. That's that they don't switch back and forth the embryos, or they don't implant spare embryos into couples without doing the process, all right? So that's the bioethics that they do. But it's sponsored and promoted by the industry itself. So it's going to be a secular bioethics. If we get a bioethics in there, a Catholic bioethics, shut it down right now. That's the bottom line Catholic bioethical analysis of this. And even not necessarily Catholic on the human level. I mean, I presented all of the arguments I presented here. I haven't talked about God, religion, or faith at all. These are human, biological, clinical aspects of creative justice. Amen.
Father, what about with abortion reduction? That is
That's
seen
another one.
mainly,
Yeah.
mainly in IVF. And,
Also?
or is it also done with the embryos? Is that considered abortion reduction?
Okay, so let's look at that. It's called selective reduction, right? Selective reduction. Is that it here? Okay, these are the euphemisms. Reduction. What is selective reduction? All right, so I said that when 3 or 4 embryos are inserted into the womb, on average, one takes. One actually implants, the other 3 are discarded, okay? To get that average, it means that sometimes none implant, so all 3 or 4 discarded, or sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 actually implant, right? To compensate for the ones who didn't implant at all. So that's the average. Therefore, what to do when the couple who wanted a child ends up with a pregnancy with 2 or 3, with triplets, all right, or twins. The Octomom, she had all 4 implanted and all 4 took. It's a rare case, but it happened. This was, again, I think it was in California that it happened coincidentally. But she had all 8 implanted and all 8 took, right? Because she didn't want to leave any cryopreserves. Seldom does that happen. The chances are that she would get 25, so maybe 2 or 3 would actually implant and the others discarded. But anyway, in this case, it was extreme, all 8 implanted. All right. Then she has the further option to select which ones during the pregnancy she wants to keep. All right, so that's the selective reduction. She can reduce the number of pregnancies that she's carried because it's legal. It's obviously an abortion. It's a procured abortion. So what's she going to select on? Well, the first obvious thing to select on is on the health of the embryo. So they're going to do either amniocentesis but that's can be confusing because you have a mix of the cells of all the embryos there. Or, well, if they each have their amniotic sac, then it would work. Or they can do chorionic village sampling, CVS, right? When they go and take a little sample of the actual tissue of the embryo, then they do a karyotyping and see if that comes out normal or not. If it comes out abnormal, then that embryo, that fetus is going to be selected out, right? In other words, that fetus is going to be killed and taken out. And that's a selective reduction. Now, this has become fairly common for multiple pregnancies, that the selective reduction can also be done on other traits, like for example, boy or girl, sex, all right? And they're selecting on sex. And who's gonna lose out? The girl, the female. Because most couples, again, they want their firstborn to be a boy. And so they're gonna select against the girl. To the point that some states are trying to pass a law that selective reduction should not be done, or even just straight up abortion should not be done for sex selection. But it's still, technically still legal. And that's the state of affairs because it's a slippery slope, right? One killing leads to another killing. And that's what we have, okay? Let's see, what else? So what to do with frozen human embryos? I talked about natural selection also. It really does deny natural selection to that child. And as it's denying natural selection to the next in vitro child, it's also denying natural selection to the whole human species because that child is not going to remain a child. That child is going to grow up, and on average, that child is going to fall in love and marry. And now we have an adult who is not necessarily the most vigorous adult that he or she could have been had they been exposed to the natural selection process, okay? So it does impact, in long term, it does impact the human population as a whole. So it should become a social issue. We should complain that it's weakening the human population. These are challenges. Most people don't see this, say, you're crazy. What are you talking about? This is not normal what you're saying. Okay. All right. What else? Okay, so we combine contraception. You understand contraception then allows the couple to have the unitive without the procreative. In vitro fertilization allows the procreative without the unitive. Either case is doing violence to the human act of intercourse in a fully human way. Right? So we have to say also that with regards to IVF, a couple would have IVF because they're infertile. But this infertility is a very complicated thing for the human. This is what I mean. A couple who is infertile, for years they've been trying to have children, nothing. They have been checked and the doctors cannot find anything clinical that is outstanding. Maybe he may have a low sperm count, but let's say he has a normal sperm count. They seem to be competent. She's ovulating normally, right? So what's going on? They still can have children. Try for 10 years, whatever time. Then they finally either go through in vitro or they adopt a child. The point is that now this infertile couple now has a child at home. 6 months later, exactly. I've heard of several cases like that. Have you heard of cases like that?
Yeah.
You hear it. So it happens. So it's real and true. So what was the infertility? The infertility was in the mind. They were trying too hard to have the child. And that psychologically was preventing the fertilization. It was suppressing her ovulation, I don't know, or it was doing something with his sperm, I don't know. But the mind was affecting the body so that this couple could not get pregnant. All right? So you see the complexity of human procreation. It's a delicate issue, all right? And we're really just beginning to know and understand the beginnings about human fertilization, which is much more sophisticated than just fusing egg and sperm. That's on one side. On the opposite side is another case of when we take the statistics of sexual assault and rape, which is this. The fertility rate of the American population now is about 10 or 11% more or less. What does that mean, fertility rate? It means that of the women in the United States who are in reproductive years, right? You can put the numbers where you want for the sake of convenience, let's say from 10 to 50 years of age. All the American women who are from 10 to 50 years of age, we'll say that in principle, these are women who are in reproductive years, right? Okay. Right now, about 10% of those women are pregnant. That's the fertility rate, all right? Each country varies somewhat and so forth. It depends on a number of factors, including the health, the overall health of the population, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a fertility rate, 10%. Okay, now we can start looking at subgroups of the general category. And what subgroup, for the purpose of my point, is women who have been victims, have undergone sexual assault and rape with intercourse, with penetration. How many of those are pregnant? It should be 10% of them. If they're in their early years, so in principle, the same number of women should be pregnant that have been victims of sexual assault or not. But they're not. It's a much less percentage. It's a much less percentage. The percentage is anywhere between 1% and 5%, depending on what actually qualifies as rape. Because again, here we have to be extremely honest. And I want to say from the onset that a sexual assault is totally, absolutely unacceptable and should always be stopped, and the aggressor should always be punished, and all that we know. But having said all that, what actually constitutes a rape, a true rape, bona fide rape, as opposed to a provocation or even a consensual sex, which then later the woman claims as rape. So we have to be extremely honest here, and it does happen, unfortunately. All right. So depending on how much you take people's word for it, it could be anywhere from 1% to 5%. But the rate of women who become pregnant during their fertile years from a sexual assault is much smaller than the 10%. Again, it's anywhere between 1% and 5%. What is that saying is that psychologically, not only is the woman rejecting the man who is aggressing her, but her body is also rejecting his sperm physiologically, while the rape is actually going on, because she didn't know about it beforehand, right? So she couldn't prevent herself beforehand. But in the actual event of the sexual assault, her not wanting that is also producing some kind of chemicals that is preventing the sperm from, or maybe suppressing her ovulation, I don't know. But the point is that the statistics are much lower, which means that there's a psychological factor that plays into human procreation big time, all right? So it's not just the physiological aspect of her ovulating a normal egg and him producing normal sperm. It's much more complicated than that. Therefore, see, the issues of contraception or IVF come into play because of what the couple wants with regards to having children. Whether they desire children or not, okay? And the fact that that whole aspect, beyond the desire, what I'm trying to get at here is that beyond the desire of having children or not, there has to be a certain level of letting go, because one thing is for the couple to want the children, and another thing is for God to want this couple to have a child, because we're talking about the creation of a new human being. And maybe for whatever reason, God doesn't want this couple to have a child right now. We at the human level call it infertility, but maybe God has a different plan. In other words, to me, at the end of the day, it's all about including or excluding God from this very sacred and special activity, which is human sexual intercourse. And that's why the Church, the Catholic Church, puts it into the context of a sacrament, of a sacred relationship. Unlike any other relationship that we have loving relationships in our lives all the time, but not all of them are a sacrament. Even the very close relationship between parents, spouses, parents and children, as sacred as we want that relationship to be, the relationship with the parents and their children, that's not a sacrament, strictly speaking. In other words, the spouses, if they marry in the church, they have a sacrament whether they have children or not. The children may be a consequence of the sacrament, all right? But strictly speaking, the sacred relationship of that man and woman is not with their children, but it's between the two of them, all right? And the same for the children, as much as we love our parents and everything else, and it's a sacred relationship in the broad sense of the word, but it's not a sacrament. Being a child is not sacramental in and of itself. And so the whole idea of either including or excluding God from this, then this whole issue of having a child becomes either a manufacturing process or a gift from God. We can make the argument that we really don't have the right to have children. The couple has a right to desire children. But no one really has a right to have another child. We have to see in what context we mean. There are two levels of saying to have a child. I think I have it here somewhere earlier. Yeah. To have a child, what do we mean by having a child? At the superficial level, yes. Normal couples want to have children, right? But it's not that child as a possession, as this, the same way that I have a computer, I have a car, or I have a house. Because a child cannot be had that way as an object, because then it's just an object of my possession. So there's another level that a child is a gift from God. Certainly from the child's perspective, none of us asked to be alive, right? So our very life is in itself a gift. So in that sense, in vitro allows the couple to have a child, right, as a possession, because they're paying for it. They're paying for the procedure. Now, this may all be at the subconscious level. The couple may not really be aware that that's going on. But you think of a couple that goes through in vitro for the expense that it costs, and even if you were covered by insurance, that couple wants that child absolutely. They want to have that child whether God wants to give them a child or not. So they're willing to override their infertility because they want to have their way. And again, very good intentions, but subconsciously, what is in the deeper background of that intention is to have that child absolutely, regardless whether they should or should not have a child. And so they're looking at that child one way or another as a possession, whether they're conscious of it or not. So this is very delicate ground. And sometimes I have to go there with couples who are infertile, and they're honestly asking about in vitro because, Father, my cousins did it, and they're also married in the church and so forth. Why can't I do it? Say, well, the hardest thing that I've ever had to say to a couple is because you don't have a right to have a child. And they say, what do you mean? No, you have a right to desire a child. My father could marry if we didn't want children. That's actually an impediment. Not to want children is to exclude children from their marriage is an impediment to marriage in the Catholic Church. Okay, in other words, the couple who are preparing for marriage should naturally want to have children at some point anyway. They may not have them immediately, but they should naturally want to have children. And if they tell me, oh, no, we really don't want children, Father says, well, no, I can't marry you either because of that. You have to work this out beforehand, okay? So they need the desire to have the children, but at the same time, they need to temper that desire with God's will, okay? So that if the children don't come, then they should not go to the in vitro clinic to manufacture that baby, because they don't have the right to actually have the child, to actually force that soul out of God's hands into this fertilized egg in the in vitro clinic. I know it's hard, probably wouldn't get too much traction with this kind of arguments in the secular environment. But if we're really honest about the human relationship and the intimacy and so forth, it is this: no matter how hard they try, the couple cannot create a soul. And so we need to leave God into the equation and be respectful of God, what God is doing with this couple. So I try to talk about the apparent silence of God in their infertility at this time. Again, because of the examples that we've seen, later on, it could be that an infertility is put aside, all right? So the apparent silence of God, what does it mean? And it can be hardship. It can be part of the cross to accept God's will at this point. So I put it in the context of their marriage vows. At this point, it would be strictly at least the couples who come for advisement, because many couples are going to the in vitro now directly without any advisement. Maybe they have a suspicion that they're going to hear, you know, an opinion to the contrary, and that's why they don't come for the advisement. But basically, when we look at the marriage vows, okay, in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad, well, maybe this is part of the sickness time, but nowhere in here does it say that we must have a child or that we have an absolute right to have a child. And so I try to get them to think about that a little bit and accept God's will in their life, offer it up as a sacrifice for now, and let God work in this couple. Maybe at some point they will have the child. But the problem that I see is seeking that control. The more control we have, the more control we want, and technology continues to offer. So this, to me, is one of the very clear issues of where we see the friction between technology and bioethics. It can be done, but may it be done, should it be done, that's the other question, okay? Just like with contraception, it can be done. In vitro fertilization, it can be done. But at least from our perspective, certainly it should not be done. It's something that we should not engage for all these reasons that I've been giving you. All right, I think I've been skipping back and forth, so the slides may not be in the right sequence as I presented them. So I think at the beginning I start here on the slides with more psychological, these are more theological reasons, actually, the unitive and the procreative, and later is it that I get here into the more physiological aspect. I'll try to reorder them a little bit. This is still, every time I give the presentation, it's a little different with regards to the order of the slides. I try to cover all of the material there. Questions, comments, anything?
I have a question.
Yes, Marina.
Going back to the embryos that they have in the womb.
Right.
That first they have a soul.
Mm-hmm.
And if then they, they just take it to medical waste or whatever.
Right.
I mean, what happens to this soul? If we say, of course, that God is not cruel and He's not going to leave an embryo without a soul.
Right.
But where does this go? I mean,
Exactly.
I don't think that it's going to be cruel to just, I don't know.
Right.
They're not that size.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the embryos, okay, to be clear, the embryos in vitro clinics, whether they're implanted or not, they're victims, right? They're victims, ontologically speaking. They didn't ask for that. They're being denied natural selection and all this. So they're already victimized at the very beginning of their lives. Mm-hmm. And for the rest of their life, they may not even know it because they may have gone through the process, God willing, a normal gestation, normal pregnancy, normal birth, and now they are walking around, they don't even know they're in vitro. Their parents will never think of telling them, and they lead a normal life, right? But what happens to those who die, or who are cryopreserved, or then thrown out, or dismembered for their stem cells? So biologically, they die. Even the ones that are cryopreserved and then after cryopreservation, they're thawed out. Not all of them survive the thawing process, right? So a number of them die there also. So these are early deaths, and this is why I said earlier that there's no minimal amount of time required to be alive or to exist to qualify for being a human and for having a soul. That's why we need to posit, really, God granting a soul at the zygote, at the fertilization, at syngamy. Therefore, these souls are what we say in God's mercy, in God's hands, in God's presence. They're certainly not baptized, okay? But there are many people who die who haven't been baptized, whether they're born or unborn. They're adults who have been baptized. It's estimated about 1/4 of the world's population are Catholic or profess Jesus Christ, somehow have known about Jesus and accepted Christ and his teachings. Whether they're actually baptized or not is a different story, but then how about that other part of humanity, the greater part of humanity, 3/4 of 7 billion people, have not even heard about Jesus Christ? Are they just going to hell? You know, we say that they are in the mercy of God. In fact, Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, spoke about the anonymous Christian. It was one particular theologian, Karl Rahner, who had this concept of what he called the anonymous Christian. The anonymous Christian is the pagan person who has never been baptized, or never even heard about Jesus Christ or his teachings, but is in fact living, existentially, he's living a Christian life. He's a decent person, he takes care of people, they are decent human beings, are they living just by the natural law of God in their heart, living a decent life. He called them anonymous Christians. Then non-Christians complain that even if they knew about Christ, don't want to accept Jesus Christ, but they're living a decent life, so they didn't want to be called anonymous. So he said later, well, okay, I'll rescind the name, but the concept still holds. In other words, let's say a Jewish person has heard about Jesus Christ, doesn't accept Jesus Christ, but is living a decent human life. In fact, they're living a Christian way of life. So one has to assume that those people are not going to hell. If anything, and that's why I love the concept of a purgatory, because they can always be in purgatory purging their whatever they did wrong, but eventually they would have access to eternal life, to heaven, to eternal life in the presence of God. So something somewhat similar. Who knows what a zygote soul looks like, all right? But whatever it looks like to God, that is a full human being. So what is the qualification for being in heaven? If we continue to, now we're going really into the purely theological arguments here, but if we take it for a couple of minutes forward, it's also our belief that death, which also was introduced, by the way, because one of the characteristics of Adam and Eve, or the first parents before the fall, was immortality, right? Which was lost with the fall in chapter 3 of Genesis. So somehow, one way or another, the fall, that original sin, introduced illness and death into humanity somehow in a very mysterious way, okay? But certainly death is the separation between body and soul, but we say it's a temporary separation because ultimately, typically at the second coming of Christ, our body will be reunited with our soul. But we say it's going to be a glorified body. We say it's going to be a glorified body because we have no idea what it's going to look like. Okay, but our body will be reunited with our soul for all eternity. And we say we even have like a precursor of that glorified body in the resurrected Christ, the risen Christ who really did appear to the apostles, who freaked out because they thought they were seeing a ghost. It says there in the scriptures, right? And so Jesus typically in those post-resurrection accounts, which are in the 4 Gospels, at the end of each one of the 4 Gospels, what do we have? We have Jesus asking for something human. First, he shows them the wounds, which are physical wounds of the cross, all right? With Thomas, put your hand into my wounds and so forth. or he'll do something human. He will typically ask for something to eat. There's nothing more human than eating, right? Have you here something to eat, he says to them when he appears, all right? Or he's actually cooking something on the shoreline, waiting for the apostles to come back, and he's here, come and eat. So he does something human so that the apostles stop freaking out and realize that they are in front of the risen Christ in a glorified body, which means that he also has a humanity. You know, he's human and divine, the two natures integrated. A little bit like that, in the sense that we are to have a glorified body. Who knows what that's going to look like, but that will be the integration, the eventual integration of our body and soul for all eternity, right? So we can take that level to the ultimate argument of the zygote also. That zygote or the blastocyst, whatever it is that died, will be reintegrated with their soul in a glorified zygote, in a glorified blastocyst, whatever that looks like. And that's why it's essential, again, to uphold the full humanity and the full personhood of the zygote. Because that zygote is going to be fully human, certainly to God, and a full human person like you and I. To us, only when we're saints will we be able to understand and comprehend that, and maybe, and participate, because they're part of the community of saints if they're in heaven. So you see, there's a lot of stuff there that we can get into, but once we go that route, we're already in the area of belief 100%. We're just trying to make sense out of our beliefs. That's kind of a long answer to a question, but so we can think of glorified zygotes, what they look like.
Is that because then on resurrection, when I know that before the Catholic Church did not approve cremation. Right?
Yeah.
So then it became
now we do.
Accepted, but under the condition that the ashes have to stay together.
Right, exactly.
Because a lot of people is like thrown in the ocean, taken to the mountains, or
exactly.
Want to keep them in their house.
Yeah.
So is that because of that glorified body that will be united with the souls that the Catholic?
Not necessarily, because if you follow, okay, so this is what happens. We're also going to talk about end-of-life issues and death and the process. And I can go into more detail if you wish at that time, okay? My problem is that whenever I'm asked a question, I cannot keep my mouth shut. I try to give some level of answer.
Because the more you speak, the more we learn.
the more confused we all get, right? But basically, okay, so we're still dealing, even with ashes, even if a person is cremated, okay, we're still dealing with sacred remains of a human person. We're dealing with the God's image somehow, even if it's just ashes, what we're dealing with, all right? And so it's not so much maintaining the integrity of the ashes per se, because God is incapable of finding every bit of those ashes wherever they are, because if that were the case, it would also apply, it would go against corruptibility. And the fact that we, sooner or later, in a tomb, we disintegrate in there in the coffin and we seep through, or the remains of us, after all the bugs are done with us and bacteria, the nutrients that are left, the chemicals are going to seep through that box eventually into the ground, and the trees around us will reabsorb whatever is left of us in nutrition. And maybe the bones will be left for a few centuries because they're calcified, and eventually they may even get mineralized. That's why we have remains of ancient people, okay? But you see that is no impediment for God, because God can somehow pull out every molecule that constitutes our bodies and reconstitute us, all right, in our integrity with our soul. More is for the respect that is still the remains of a human being. And those remains belong in a sacred place, in a place that is dedicated to the dead, which we call cemetery, as opposed to the ocean or the mountain or the person's backyard and so forth, okay? So it's the respect that is due even to the remains of a human being. Now, the church has evolved somewhat there a little bit, in the sense that before cremation was not seen properly. Oh, by the way, when there is cremation, there have to be two things upheld, at least for the Catholic belief, is that with the cremation, the resurrection of the dead is not questioned, right? Which is more the theological side of things, that the resurrection of this dead ashes is not questioned on the second coming. And number two, that the ashes will be properly disposed of precisely in a cemetery. It doesn't have to be a Catholic cemetery, but it should be a cemetery. Mm-hmm. And then what the priest or the deacon will do will go to that non-Catholic cemetery, at least bless that grave so that that ground is sacred ground because it was blessed. All right. In the Catholic cemetery, when it's inaugurated by the bishop or the archbishop, then all of the ground is already become sacred by the blessing of the inauguration of that Catholic cemetery. We can get into more stuff now with the secular cemeteries that are in town and the funeral homes buying the cemeteries and making a package deal, the funeral and the cemetery and the burial and all that. And then they'll talk about a Catholic section in a non-Catholic cemetery. That's all publicity. I'll have more to say about the funeral industry when we get to the end of life issues. Okay, and I have plenty more to say about that then. But so back to the original question of the ashes should be maintained, the integrity, because it can fall also into manipulation. One time I heard that this family was a fairly large family, was maybe the grandmother or grandfather who had died, or maybe great-grandfather. Well, they opened their urn and they started distributing bits and pieces of ashes to different people so that everybody have a piece of grandmother at home. You know, exactly. It's not proper. It lends itself to superstition, and it lends itself to manipulation and disrespect ultimately to the dead person.
And not accepting them.
Yes, that's true also, trying to linger to hold on to that ancestor, okay? Yeah, that's another aspect. Sometimes the ashes, that's the downside of cremation. Of course, it's much cheaper than the full body burial. The downside is that sometimes those ashes are kept in the closet provisionally until they're taken somewhere else to be buried. But then that keeps extending, and then the people move, and what to do with the box. So it's challenging. And because of all these things, and we've seen an increase, a very high increase in cremations in the recent years, the church has accepted for cremation, again, as long as those two things are in place, the resurrection of these ashes is not questioned, reintegrated into a full human being in God's majesty, and that the ashes will be properly disposed of fairly soon after the cremation. And now, even further, the ashes can actually be brought into church, kind of equivalent to the full body coffin, which makes it much easier, much cheaper, and also displaces, gives time for people who used to come to the funeral if they couldn't come to the funeral before, right? Because, you know, the full body funeral has to be done, a full body mass and burial has to be done fairly quickly after the death. Even if they're embalsamados and everything else with process involved. So cremation does make it much easier to maintain the 3 stages of a Christian burial, which is the vigil the night before, typically done at the funeral home, but can be done elsewhere. Then the mass of resurrection for that dead person with the body present, either full body or cremains, and then the interment in a cemetery. Those are the 3 stages of Christian burial. I think I've gone too much into the end of life course, but that's part of what I'll cover there. Sure.
It seems like if we really taught, especially our Catholic kids, the respect, like we say, the respect for human life in the beginning, but that's the zygote. Right? So that they grow up knowing that. And then if they go to an IVF place, they say, wait a minute.
Exactly.
The embryo is a zygote. That is a human. What are you talking about? Because I feel like, you know, if we think we don't do a good job teaching respect life, like at the beginning, the IVF thing, I'm sure there's so many people, Catholics, that they just don't think it's a big deal.
Even within the church, I cannot tell you the number of priests that tell me, Alfred, this is a pro-life thing. IVF, this couple, I married them. They can't have children. And they happen to have the money. You know, everybody's been saving for this. This is a group project. Everybody's chipping in so they can have a child. This is, how can you tell me this is not for life? Well, if you give me a few minutes, I'll tell you why. But he's a priest. And so it's that challenging. Way back in the 80s when this started, I raised all kinds of flags and tried to get people to realize, just like with Dolly, wait a minute, cloning a mammal, you know, it's essentially the same technique for a human than a non-human. Cloning a mammal is essentially the same technique in the lab. Fortunately, you know, stem cell research and human cloning went sideways simply because of the medicine is not good. In other words, the adult stem cells are much better clinically than embryonic stem cells. There's no immune rejection, and they actually don't cause tumors and things like that. But had it been that embryonic stem cells, and still some labs are still fixated on working with embryonic stem cells, all right, human stem cells, that are killing human embryos. But I digressed. Anyway, the point is trying to get this message of the humanity of the human embryo. Fully human, a person anthropologically. It's very hard to get that across in today's society that stays very much at the superficial, but it doesn't even look like a human. Well, it looks like a human, how they're supposed to look at that stage. You look like that when you were at that stage, and I did too. But see, so they are philosophical arguments in the end, right? It's about right reasoning, which has been lost a lot in our society. If we still had a lot of right, logical reasoning people, we wouldn't be in the troubles that we're in, the messes that we find. But these are the arguments, and they can get a little esoteric for people. But this is what anchors the arguments. I cannot think of any other. If we go the emotional way, we can make emotional arguments against in vitro and all that, but I know that in the end we're not going to we're not going to win the battle. We're going to lose. On the emotional side, we're going to lose because people can raise all kinds of emotions of why this pregnant woman should have an abortion, or why they should contracept, or why they should have in vitro. The emotional arguments in favor of that, we can see that they can stack up to the sky. But that's how we circulate, right? And most of the decisions being made now are either emotional or ideological, and they don't have a biological or a logical backing, but they have a big influence in our society. Bottom line, folks, be very patient. This is like the shrimp. You know the shrimp? I love shrimp. I know if you like shrimp, it's high in cholesterol, but I still love it. And yeah, you have to peel the shrimp, but also the muscle, what we eat of the shrimp is the muscle, right? It's the abdomen, it's the tail end. And why is that muscle so large, disproportionately large, as compared to the rest of the shrimp? Because it's always swimming against the current. It's always going upstream. It's always going upstream.
That's where we are now.
Exactly. So that's how we are. We're going upstream here. So if anything, we're going to get intellectual muscles very big. Okay, folks, I'm going to stop here before it gets even worse. All right. Thank you very much. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.